morning Eleanor Hartwell ironed her cream linen dress, she pricked her finger on a loose pin hidden in the collar seam. A small drop of blood appeared on her thumb, and she pressed it against her palm quickly so it would not stain the fabric. She stood at the ironing board in the kitchen, watching the steam rise, and told herself the sharp sting meant nothing. She was good at telling herself things meant nothing. Eleanor was 38 years old. She had a narrow face, dark brown eyes that people often described as serious, and the kind of quiet manner that made strangers assume she was either very shy or very intelligent. She was both. She had grown up in a small village outside of Dorchester, the daughter of a librarian mother and a father who repaired clocks for a living. She had learned early that things which were broken could be fixed with patience and the right tools. She had carried that belief into every part of her adult life. She had met Richard Hartwell at a dinner party when she was 26. He was tall, confident, and had a way of walking into a room as though he had already decided he liked it. He was an architect by profession and a charmer by nature. He told her on their second evening together that she was the most genuinely interesting person he had met in years, and she had believed him completely, because no one had ever said anything like that to her before. They were married 2 years later in a small church in Dorset. Eleanor wore her grandmother's veil. Richard cried during the vows, which surprised everyone, including Eleanor. It was one of the things she would think about often in the years that followed. Those tears, how real they had seemed. 11 years is a long time to build a life. Eleanor and Richard had built theirs carefully. They lived in a 4-bedroom house in Kensington with bay windows that caught the afternoon light beautifully. They had a garden that Eleanor tended herself, roses along the south wall, lavender near the gate, a small herb bed beside the kitchen door. She cooked well. She read widely. She attended every event Richard deemed important, stood at every function beside him, smiled at every colleague and client he needed her to smile at. She had wanted children. They had tried, and it had not happened. And after 2 years of quiet heartbreak, she had stopped speaking about it. Richard had seemed relieved when the subject faded. Eleanor had noticed that. She had filed it away in the part of herself where she kept all the things she noticed but chose not to examine. Their marriage, from the outside, looked like a success. From the inside, it felt, more recently, like a large house with some rooms she was no longer allowed to enter. There were weekends where Richard was unreachable, long evenings where he came home from the office smelling of wine and some unfamiliar warm air she could not name. Mornings where he was kind to her in the careful, over-deliberate way that people are kind when they feel guilty about something. Eleanor noticed. She always noticed. But noticing and knowing are two very different things. And she had become, over 11 years, extraordinarily skilled at stopping just before she reached the point of knowing. She finished ironing the dress and hung it on the wardrobe door. Through the bedroom window she could see the garden below, the roses already beginning to open in the June warmth. She had almost told Richard she didn't want to go to the Pembrys party. She had even begun the sentence, "I was thinking I might skip it this year. I've had such a..." And he had looked up from his phone with an expression so sharp and brief that she had changed course mid-sentence and finished with, "Long week, but of course we should go." She had changed course, as she often did. The Pembrys were old friends of Richard's family. Oliver Pembry had been at school with Richard's older brother, and his wife, Diane, was one of those women who organized their social calendar the way generals organized campaigns, with strategy, with precision, and with very little tolerance for anyone who failed to show up. Their annual garden party at Ashford House, a Georgian property in Richmond with grounds that stretched down to a bend in the river, was the kind of event that people in their circle attended, not necessarily because they enjoyed it, but because not attending sent a message they didn't want to send. Eleanor understood this world. She had not been born into it, but she had learned its rhythms and its rules with the same methodical attention she gave to everything. She knew which people to greet first. She knew which subjects to raise and which to carefully avoid. She knew how to move through a gathering like this with a light touch, making everyone feel slightly better about themselves, which was, she had come to understand, the most useful skill a person could possess in rooms like these. She put on the cream linen dress. She chose pearl earrings. She pressed her lips together once in front of the mirror and looked at herself steadily for a moment. Not critically, the way women are often encouraged to look at themselves, but honestly. She saw a woman who was tired in a way that sleep did not fix. She saw a woman who had become very good at arriving places and very uncertain about where she actually wanted to be. She picked up her handbag and went downstairs. Richard was already waiting in the hallway, checking something on his phone with the focused attention he rarely gave to anything else these days. He was wearing a pale blue shirt that she had bought him for his birthday, though she noticed he had not mentioned this. He looked up when she appeared on the stairs and gave her the particular smile he saved for occasions. Warm, appreciative. the smile of a man who knew how to present the right face at the right moment. "You look wonderful," he said. "Thank you," she said. They drove to Richmond mostly in silence. Richard listened to a podcast about investment trends. Eleanor watched the city pass outside her window, the parks beginning to fill with Saturday afternoon people, dogs running ahead of their owners, couples walking with the easy familiarity of those who have run out of things to surprise each other with. She found herself watching the couples, trying to read them from the outside the way a stranger might read her and Richard. She wondered what strangers saw. They arrived at Ashford House at 2:20. Diane Pembry met them at the gate with 2 glasses of chilled white wine and the wide, practiced smile of the perfect hostess. She kissed Eleanor on both cheeks, told her the dress was absolutely divine, and then turned the full beam of her attention to Richard, who received it with the ease of a man accustomed to being the center of things. Eleanor took her wine and stepped into the garden. It was, she had to admit, a beautiful afternoon. The grounds of Ashford House were at their very best in June. The flower beds along the south terrace were a mass of color. Pale pink peonies, deep blue delphiniums, white hydrangeas in clouds against the old stone wall. Round tables with ivory cloths had been set out across the lawn, each one decorated with a small bunch of sweet peas in a glass vase. String lights had been threaded through the branches of the old cedar tree near the far end of the garden. It was the kind of setting that made people feel, however briefly, that life was beautiful and arranged and full of good things. Eleanor walked slowly along the terrace, greeting people as she went. She spoke to Oliver Pembry about a renovation project he was considering. She talked with Harriet Vane, an art consultant whose sharp wit Eleanor had always quietly admired, about a recent exhibition at the Tate. She laughed at a story told by Geoffrey Nolan, a retired surgeon with an enormous mustache and the storytelling ability of a natural performer. She was, as she always was at these events, perfectly present, listening, responding, making the people around her feel heard. And yet beneath the surface of all this, something was pulling at her attention, a feeling she had learned over many years not to trust. She saw Richard before she quite registered what she was looking at. He was standing near the rose arbor at the far end of the garden, the one Diane always claimed as her finest achievement, a curved wooden arch completely covered in pale yellow climbing roses. He was laughing, not the polite, managed laugh he produced at networking events, but the loose, unguarded laugh of a man who was entirely comfortable. The laugh Eleanor had once been the cause of in the early years, before something had quietly shifted between them. She would have moved on. She would have told herself she was imagining things. But then the woman beside him turned slightly, and Eleanor saw her face. She was younger than Eleanor, perhaps 30, perhaps a little more. She had dark hair that fell in a smooth wave over one shoulder, and she was wearing a dress the color of deep coral, fitted and elegant, with the confidence of someone who had chosen it knowing exactly the effect it would have. She was holding a glass of champagne loosely, the way you hold something when you are not thinking about it at all, when your whole attention is given to the person beside you. Eleanor had never seen her before. She was certain of that. And yet something about the way the woman stood beside Richard, the angle of her body, slightly turned toward him, the familiarity of it, sent a cold, steady current through Eleanor's chest. She looked away. She took a sip of her wine. She spoke to someone, she could not afterward recall who, and smiled at whatever they said. But she did not move toward the rose arbor, and she did not seek Richard out, and she held her glass very carefully for the rest of the afternoon, because her hands had begun, very quietly, to shake. There was a moment, standing near the lavender border with Harriet Vane and 2 women she barely knew, where Eleanor allowed herself to look back across the garden. Richard and the woman were still there. The woman was saying something. Richard had tilted his head to one side, the way he did when he was completely absorbed by what he was hearing. Eleanor had not seen him tilt his head like that in a very long time, perhaps 2 years, perhaps more. She remembered, suddenly and with the kind of clarity that arrives uninvited. A Christmas 3 years ago. She had asked Richard to help her choose a gift for herself, a small indulgence she rarely allowed. She had seen a dress she loved in a boutique in Chelsea, deep coral, elegant, limited edition. She had shown him the photograph. He had looked at it, said the cut was beautiful, and then told her, 2 weeks later, that he had called the shop and they were completely sold out. He was sorry. He had tried. She had told him it didn't matter at all. Now, across the garden, she watched a woman she had never met, wearing a dress the precise color of coral, in what appeared to be exactly the same cut, standing beside her husband with the ease of someone who had been chosen and knew it. Eleanor set her glass down on a nearby table. She was careful not to set it down too hard. She excused herself from the group she was standing with, saying she needed to find the ladies' room, and walked inside the house, through the beautiful Georgian hallway with its black and white tiled floor, and its enormous arrangement of white lilies, and into the small downstairs sitting room that she knew from previous visits was usually quiet. She sat down on the edge of a striped silk chair. She pressed her hands together in her lap. She breathed slowly and deliberately, the way she had once been taught in a yoga class she had stopped attending. She sat there for perhaps 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes she let herself think, properly and clearly, about what she had just seen. She was not a dramatic woman. She had never been prone to leaping to conclusions. She believed in evidence and fairness, and the importance of not deciding something until you had the full picture. But she was also, beneath all of it, someone who had always trusted the quiet certainty that arrived sometimes without explanation, that arrived not with panic but with a kind of still, terrible knowing. And that certainty was present now. It had been present, she realized, for much longer than this afternoon. It had been there in the changed cologne, in the late evenings, in the careful kindness, in the way Richard looked at his phone and tilted the screen away. She had simply not allowed herself to arrive at this particular room before now. She straightened her back. She smoothed the front of her cream linen dress. She thought of the small drop of blood on her thumb that morning, pressed quickly against her palm. She was not going to fall apart in Diane Pembry's sitting room. She was not going to cry in front of a vase of dahlias on a Saturday afternoon. She was going to go back out into that garden, and she was going to hold herself together with every tool she had, and she was going to wait until she was home and alone before she allowed any of this to be real. She stood up. She walked back through the hallway. She stepped out through the French doors onto the terrace. The garden was bright and warm and full of people who had no idea that anything was wrong. The string lights in the cedar tree caught the sun. The sweet peas on the tables gave off their light, delicate scent. Someone laughed near the pond, a bright, ringing sound that carried across the lawn. Eleanor picked up a fresh glass of wine from a passing tray, smiled at a woman she did not know, and stepped back into the afternoon as though nothing had changed. Nothing had changed, not yet, but in the part of Eleanor Hartwell that had always known things before she allowed herself to know them, something had already shifted completely and could not be shifted back. She looked once more toward the rose arbor. Richard was still there. The woman in the coral dress was still there. And Eleanor, who had spent 11 years being the woman who stayed, who smoothed things over, who told herself that the things she noticed meant nothing. Eleanor stood very still in that garden and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was not sadness and was not anger. It was clarity. It arrived not like a storm but like a light being switched on in a room she had been navigating in the dark for years. It was quiet, and it was certain, and it showed her everything exactly as it was. She did not look away this time. Eleanor did not go back to the rose arbor. She did not walk across the garden and stand beside her husband and the woman in the coral dress and wait to see what would happen. That was not who she was. She had never been someone who moved toward fire. She had always been someone who assessed the heat from a careful distance and then decided, methodically, what to do next. Instead, she stayed near the terrace, with its long view of the lawns and the cedar tree and the river glinting at the far edge of the property. And she continued doing the things she had always done at events like this. She was present, she was warm, she was the kind of company that made people feel at ease. Harriet Vane found her again near the hydrangea border, fresh glass in hand, and pulled her into a conversation about a painter from Cornwall whose work had apparently caused significant argument at a recent auction. Eleanor listened. She contributed. She was, from the outside, entirely herself. Inside, something very different was happening. She was building a picture, not dramatically, not frantically, but with the steady, organized attention she had given to everything since childhood. The way a person assembles a puzzle not by forcing pieces together but by studying each one carefully and setting it beside the others until a shape begins to emerge. The dress. That was the clearest piece. She had seen the photograph on the boutique's website. She had shown it to Richard. He had said it was beautiful. He had told her 2 weeks later that it was sold out. He had said he was sorry. And she, good, trusting Eleanor, had told him it did not matter, and meant it, because she was not someone who placed enormous importance on things. She had let it go completely. She had not thought about it again until this afternoon, when she saw it in full color, moving through her husband's garden party, worn by a woman she had never met. The dress was not, in itself, evidence of anything, except that Richard had not told her the truth about a phone call. People told small untruths. Marriages contained small untruths. She understood this. She was not naive. But there was the dress, and there was the laugh she no longer caused, and there was the way the woman stood. Not like a colleague, not like an acquaintance, not even like a close friend, but with that particular ease that only existed between people who had decided they belonged to each other. And there was something else, something Eleanor had not let herself think about directly until now. 4 months ago, Richard had told her he had a work trip to Edinburgh. 3 days. A project he was managing for a developer there. He had packed carefully, taken his good luggage, and kissed her on the cheek at the door with the distracted affection of a man who had somewhere to be. Eleanor had spent the 3 days quietly, contentedly. She had repotted her herbs, read 2 books, had dinner with her old friend Claire on the second evening. She had not thought much about Richard's absence, because she had grown, without entirely noticing it, accustomed to his absences. On the evening of the second day, she had found a dry cleaning ticket in the inside pocket of his gray overcoat while looking for a pen. The ticket was dated the same week as the Edinburgh trip. She had thought nothing of it, had put it on the kitchen counter with the intention of mentioning it when he returned. She had forgotten to mention it. The ticket had been cleared away at some point, and she had not thought of it again. Until this afternoon, when she found herself thinking about it with a strange, cold precision. Because the dry cleaning ticket had been from a shop on Marylebone High Street, and if Richard had been in Edinburgh for 3 days, he had not left his overcoat in a Marylebone dry cleaner the week of his trip. Small pieces. She was not the kind of woman who built catastrophes from small pieces. She was fair-minded enough to know that dry cleaning tickets could be misremembered, that the woman in the coral dress might have found it herself, that there were other explanations for most things. But she was also, under all her fairness, someone who had an excellent memory and a very quiet instinct that had never, in 38 years, steered her completely wrong. She was still standing with Harriet Vane when she became aware that the atmosphere in the garden had shifted slightly. It was not a dramatic change, just a subtle recalibration, the way a room feels when someone enters who changes the balance of it. She looked up. A man had appeared near the far end of the terrace. He was tall, probably mid-40s, with broad shoulders, and the kind of unhurried posture that tends to belong to people who have never particularly needed to prove anything. He was wearing a dark jacket that fit him well, and held a glass of something clear with ice. He had dark hair beginning to gray slightly at the temples, and a face that was not precisely handsome in any easy or obvious way, but that held your attention once you looked at it, the way certain paintings do, not because they are decorated, but because they are honest. She did not know who he was, but she noticed, because Eleanor noticed everything, that several conversations around the terrace paused momentarily as he moved through them, not rudely, not in the way that famous or powerful people sometimes caused heads to turn and mouths to fall open, more quietly than that. The pauses were brief and instinctive, the way people pause when they become aware of a presence they hadn't anticipated. Diane Pembry appeared at his side within moments, and Eleanor watched her hostess's manner take on a particular quality. The heightened warmth, the slightly increased brightness, that Diane reserved for guests of a certain standing. Eleanor filed this away without dwelling on it and returned her attention to Harriet. "You've gone somewhere," Harriet said, watching her with the shrewd gray eyes of someone who had spent 3 decades reading people and art for a living. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said. "I was miles away. Somewhere interesting, I hope." "Not particularly," Eleanor said. Harriet gave her a long, level look, the kind that said she was not fooled but was too well-bred to press. She raised her glass and turned the conversation gracefully to something else, which was one of the things Eleanor had always liked about her. The afternoon moved on. The light shifted, as June light does, from the bright, sharp clarity of midday to something warmer and more golden. The string lights in the cedar tree became visible against the softening sky. More wine was poured. More conversations were begun and ended and begun again. Plates of food appeared on a long table near the house, things elegantly arranged, things meant to be admired as much as eaten. Eleanor ate a little. She moved through the garden with her usual ease. She greeted and listened and smiled, and no one looking at her would have known that she was doing any of this with a portion of her attention devoted entirely to the far end of the garden, where Richard and the woman in the coral dress had moved from the rose arbor to a table near the hedge, where they sat together now with the naturalness of 2 people who had sat together many times before. She watched them for a total of perhaps 45 seconds across the whole afternoon, in small, careful glances, because she did not want to look and she did not want to be seen looking. What she saw in those 45 seconds was enough. They did not touch. They were too careful for that, here, in a garden full of people who knew Richard. But there was something in the way they occupied the same space, the unconscious mirroring of posture, the way they leaned toward each other when they spoke, the way the woman once reached over and straightened a small thing on the table between them, a perfectly ordinary gesture that nonetheless contained within it an entire history of ease and familiarity. that told Eleanor everything she needed to know without a single word being spoken. She thought of Richard's tears during their wedding vows. She thought of the first apartment they had shared, the small one in Battersea with the unreliable heating and the beautiful view over the rooftops. She thought of an evening early in their marriage when she had been unwell with a bad cold and he had sat beside her on the sofa for an entire evening doing nothing except keeping her company, not even watching television, just sitting with her because she was there and he had wanted to be near her. She thought of all the ways a person could be one thing and then, slowly, become another. She thought of how long that transformation could take, and how invisible it could be to the person standing closest to it. She did not feel, in this moment, the dramatic crumbling she might have expected. She felt something quieter and, in its own way, more serious than that. She felt the particular ache of someone who has been wrong about something they built their life around. Not the shock of a sudden revelation, but the settling confirmation of something she had, beneath all her careful not knowing, already understood. She was standing near the edge of the terrace, looking at nothing in particular, when she heard her name. Eleanor. She turned. Richard was walking toward her from across the lawn, alone. He had the careful, easy manner of a man who was managing something. She recognized that manner. She had always recognized it, and chosen not to name it. "I was looking for you," he said when he reached her. "Have you had a chance to speak to Jeffrey? He's been asking about you. Apparently his wife loved the last book you recommended to her." It was so ordinary. So perfectly, smoothly ordinary. He stood before her with his blue shirt and his easy smile, and his voice carried no trace of anything except mild, pleasant concern about Jeffrey Nolan's reading habits. "Not yet," Eleanor said. "I'll find him." "Are you all right?" Richard said. He tipped his head to one side slightly, a gesture she had always found endearing, the gesture of a man paying close attention. She understood now that she could no longer trust what she saw. "I'm perfectly fine," she said. "It's a beautiful afternoon." He nodded, satisfied. He put his hand briefly on her lower back, the proprietary, affectionate gesture of a man marking what was his, and then someone called his name from across the garden and he moved away with a quick, apologetic smile. Eleanor stood exactly where she was. She did not turn to watch him go. Instead, she turned back to the garden, to the golden light and the sweet peas and the cedar tree with its lights beginning to glow, and she made herself a promise she had never made before in 11 years of marriage. She made it quietly, without ceremony, to no one except herself. She was done looking away. Whatever came next, she was going to look at it directly. She was going to see it as it was, not as she had needed it to be. She was going to stop filing things away in the dark interior room, where she kept all the things that frightened her. The decision arrived not with grief, that would come later, but with a strange, clear strength, the kind that appears in people when they have finally stopped fighting the current and allowed themselves to understand which direction the water is actually moving. She smoothed the front of her dress. She finished her wine. She walked across the lawn to find Jeffrey Nolan and ask about his wife's reading. She did all of this very well. She was, after all, a woman who had spent 11 years becoming very good at exactly this kind of thing. But she was also, from this moment forward, a different woman than the one who had arrived at Ashford House at 2:20. The difference was invisible to everyone around her. It was not invisible to Eleanor. She had seen what she had seen. She had allowed herself to know what she knew. And nothing, not Richard's easy smile, not his careful hand on her back, not the beautiful afternoon, or the sweet peas on the tables, or the golden June light, could undo the quiet, certain shift that had taken place inside her. She laughed at Jeffrey's story. She stayed for another hour. She helped Diane carry a tray of glasses inside when the first guests began to leave. And when she and Richard drove home through the evening city, and he talked about the party in the easy, comfortable way of a man who believed everything was exactly as he had arranged it, Eleanor sat with her hands in her lap and looked out at the city lights and listened to him and said the right things at the right moments. She was very good at this. She always had been. But something had shifted, something that could not be shifted back. She did not sleep that night. Richard fell asleep quickly, as he always did, with his back to her and one arm tucked under the pillow. Eleanor lay on her side of the bed and listened to his breathing even out, and then she lay on her back and looked at the ceiling, and then she turned carefully onto her other side so that she was facing the window, where the gap in the curtains let in a thin line of orange from the street lamp outside. She was not crying. She had been expecting to cry, and it had not happened, which surprised her. Instead, she was simply awake, very awake, with the kind of wakefulness that is not about restlessness but about thinking, the brain moving through things with a precision it refuses to apply during the busyness of the day. She thought about the past 3 years. She went through them methodically. The way she had once heard a detective in a television program describe his method, not looking for anything in particular, simply allowing things to come forward that had been sitting quietly at the back. Things came forward. The Edinburgh trip, the dry cleaning ticket from Marylebone, a phone call Richard had taken in the garden last August, walking away from her toward the far end of the garden path and keeping his voice low. An evening in February when she had looked at his laptop screen while he was in the kitchen and seen a message notification, just a name and the first few words, and he had come back in and closed the laptop before she could fully read it, and she had decided, swiftly and completely, that she had not seen anything at all. She had been doing that. She had been making small, split-second decisions not to see things for what they appeared to be. Not out of weakness, she thought, or not only that, more out of a deep, almost physical reluctance to dismantle something she had invested so much of herself in building, because to see it clearly would mean to ask questions, and to ask questions would mean to hear answers, and hearing answers would mean that the life she had spent 11 years constructing, carefully, faithfully, with genuine love, would need to be looked at in a different light entirely. She had not been ready. Until today. She thought about the woman in the coral dress. She did not yet know her name. She did not know where she had come from or how long it had been happening or what, exactly, she was to Richard. She only knew what she had seen, and what she had seen was unambiguous. At some point around 2 a.m, Eleanor made a decision. It was not a dramatic decision. It arrived the same way the clarity had arrived in the garden, quietly and with absolute certainty. She was going to find out the truth. Not through confrontation, not through anger, not through the kind of scene that left everyone worse than they had found themselves. She was going to find it carefully, in her own time, in a way that left her standing on solid ground when the moment came. She turned onto her back again. She looked at the ceiling. She breathed slowly. Beside her, Richard slept, undisturbed and unknowing, and Eleanor Hartwell lay in the dark and began, with great steadiness, to understand exactly who she was going to have to be. She found the name on a Tuesday. Eleanor had not gone looking for it with any kind of urgency. She was not, by nature, someone who rushed toward things. She waited until Richard was at the office and she had the house to herself, and then she sat down at the kitchen table with her tea and opened his laptop, which he had left behind that morning, hurrying for a meeting, and which she had never opened before in 11 years because she had never felt she had any reason to. She felt she had a reason now. She was not trembling. She noted this about herself with a kind of detached interest. Her hands were perfectly steady. She opened the laptop. She knew his password, the date of their first holiday together, a week in Tuscany, the summer after they were engaged. She had known the password for years and never used it. She typed it in. The inbox was open on the screen. She did not read the messages. She told herself, very deliberately, that she was not going to read other people's private correspondence. That was a line she intended to keep. She scrolled only enough to see what she needed to see, which was a name. She was looking for a name she could attach to a face, because the face was the thing she could not stop seeing. The name appeared in the 5th message down. Camille. She said it quietly to herself, just once, the way you say the title of a book you haven't read yet. Then she closed the laptop, pushed it to the far end of the table, and sat with both hands around her tea mug and looked at the herb garden through the kitchen window. Camille. A name with weight to it, a name that sounded like the beginning of something that was meant to be beautiful. She did not look up the name. She did not search social media or databases or photograph archives. She had enough. She had a name to put to a face, and that was all she needed for now. What she was going to do with it, she had not yet decided. She was still in the part of the process where clarity mattered more than action. She finished her tea. She washed the mug. She went out to the garden and spent an hour on her knees beside the herb bed, pulling the weeds that had crept in along the south edge. Physical work had always been something that helped her think, or rather helped her stop thinking. The particular mercy of a task that required hands and concentration and nothing else. She thought about what she wanted. This was a question she did not have a simple answer to. She had wanted her marriage to work. She had wanted the life she had built. She had wanted, beneath all of it, for the version of Richard that had cried at their wedding vows to have been the real one, and all the subsequent distance to have been something that could be fixed with patience and the right tools. But she was a clear-eyed woman, and she was becoming more clear-eyed by the day. And what she could see now that she had allowed the light in, was that a person cannot fix something that the other person does not want fixed, and that she had been, for some time, attempting to repair something alone that required 2 people. She sat back on her heels and pressed her earth-stained palms against her thighs, and looked at the rose along the south wall, which was in full bloom this week, a deep, uncompromising red. She had planted it the first summer they moved in. She had tended it carefully. It had rewarded her with 11 years of extraordinary blooms. She thought, at least the garden has been honest with me. The thought was so dry and so sudden that she surprised herself by almost laughing. She stood up. She went inside. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink, watching the soil turn dark in the running water, and then disappear. That afternoon she called Claire. Claire Whitfield had been Eleanor's closest friend since university. They had met in their first week, in a lecture on Victorian literature, where Claire had leaned over and whispered a commentary on the lecturer's shoes that was so precise and so wicked that Eleanor had bitten her lip to keep from laughing out loud. They had been friends for 17 years. Claire was a solicitor who lived in Bristol with her husband, Patrick, and their 2 daughters, and she was the kind of friend who did not require explanation or context, who could read Eleanor's voice in 3 words and understand in 10 minutes what another person would take 3 hours to convey. Eleanor did not tell Claire everything. She was not ready to tell anyone everything, but she told her enough, that she was having a difficult week, that she had some things to think through, that she was all right but she could use a conversation that was not about anything in particular. Claire, who understood this perfectly, talked to her for an hour about the solicitor's office drama, about her youngest daughter's recently developed passion for horse riding, about a television series she had been watching that was absolutely infuriating and absolutely impossible to stop watching. And Eleanor sat in her favorite chair in the sitting room and listened and responded and felt, for the first time in several days, like a person who existed in the world rather than inside her own head. Before they rang off, Claire said, quietly and without preamble, "If something's wrong, Elle, and you're ready to tell me, I'm here." "I know," Eleanor said. "Thank you. I mean properly here. I'll drive up if you need me to." "I know," Eleanor said again. "I'm all right." She was not sure whether this was true, but she intended to make it true, which was, she had found, often the more useful place to begin. Richard came home that evening at 7:30, slightly later than usual, with a bottle of wine and the slightly too cheerful manner he produced on evenings when he was managing his own conscience. He kissed her cheek. He said the wine was a good one. He asked about her day. She told him about the weeding she had done. He admired the roses through the kitchen window and said they were particularly good this year. They ate together. She had made a simple pasta, nothing complicated, nothing that required much thought. They talked about a television program. They talked about a news story Richard had read. They talked about a letter from Eleanor's mother about a family gathering in the summer. They were, from the outside, entirely a married couple having a Tuesday evening. Inside Eleanor's chest, something had drawn itself into a very still, very watchful place, like an animal that has sensed something approaching and has decided that its best strategy is perfect stillness. She watched Richard across the table. She watched his eyes, which were brown and familiar, and which she had trusted completely for 11 years. She watched the way he poured his wine, the particular automatic confidence of a man doing something he had done 10,000 times. She watched his hands, which she knew, the scar on his left knuckle from a kitchen accident years ago, the way he always turned his ring unconsciously when he was thinking. He wore the ring. She noticed this with a sensation she could not exactly name. He still wore the ring. She did not know whether this made things better or worse. She decided it made things neither. It was simply a fact. After dinner, Richard watched television in the sitting room while Eleanor washed up. Standing at the sink, she could hear the low sound of the program he was watching, the occasional rise and fall of voices from the screen. She washed each plate carefully, dried it, set it back in the cupboard. She cleaned the worktops. She put the leftover pasta in a container in the fridge. She was thinking, as she did all of this, about what came next. Not the larger next, the confrontation, the conversation, whatever form that would take when it eventually came. The immediate next. She was thinking about the fact that she was not yet ready. She needed to know more clearly what she was facing before she said anything at all. She needed facts. Not assumptions, not impressions, not the weight of accumulated feeling. Facts. She needed to know how long. She needed to know how serious. She needed to know whether what she had seen in the garden was the whole of it or only the edge of something larger. She needed, she realized, the particular kind of courage that required not action but patience. The courage to wait, and to watch, and to gather information with the calm steadiness of someone who knew the conversation was coming, and wanted to arrive at it fully prepared. She dried her hands on the kitchen towel. She hung it neatly on the oven handle. She stood for a moment looking at the garden through the dark window, where nothing was visible except the vague shapes of the roses and the kitchen light reflecting back at her. She thought of the woman named Camille. She thought of the coral dress and the champagne glass held loosely, and the way she had stood beside Richard in the rose arbor. With such ease, such complete ease. She thought of herself standing on the other side of the garden, holding her wine carefully, noticing. There was a version of this story where Eleanor was the tragic figure, the wronged wife, patient and suffering, diminished by what had happened to her. She had heard those stories. She had read them in books, seen them in films. The woman who waits and suffers and eventually either forgives or breaks. That was not the story she intended to live. She did not know yet exactly what her story was. She only knew what it was not. It was not going to be the story of a woman undone by what she discovered. It was not going to be the story of a woman who stayed small because smallness was safer. She turned off the kitchen light and went through to the sitting room and sat beside Richard on the sofa and watched the rest of his program. She was comfortable beside him, she noticed, even now, which was perhaps the strangest part of all of this, that 11 years of ordinary life did not simply stop feeling familiar just because the ground beneath it had turned out to be different than she thought. She watched the screen. She sat with her feet tucked beneath her hands in her lap, her face composed and present. And inside, in the still and watchful place, she waited. She waited for the right moment, and the right information, and the right understanding of exactly who she was and what she deserved. She was beginning to think that what she deserved was considerably more than she had been given. 3 days after the garden party, Eleanor did something she had never done before in her marriage. She followed Richard. She would not have called it following if someone had asked her to describe it. She would have said she was simply paying attention to things she had previously chosen not to pay attention to. The distinction mattered to her. Richard had a late meeting on Thursday evening, or so he said. He often had late meetings. Eleanor had, in previous years, spent those evenings contentedly reading or gardening or having dinner with Claire when Claire was in London. She had not wondered much about the meetings. She had believed they were meetings because she had chosen to believe it. On Thursday, when Richard left the house at 6:30 with his jacket over his arm and his phone in his hand, Eleanor waited 5 minutes and then followed at a careful distance. She felt strange doing it. She felt both foolish and necessary. The way you feel doing something you know is needed but cannot quite make dignified. She had put on a coat that was different from her usual ones, darker, less distinctive, which she recognized as an absurdity, and did anyway. She did not have to follow him far. He walked to the end of their street and turned left. He walked 2 more blocks. He pushed open the door of a small Italian restaurant she had been inside exactly once, 3 years ago, for a colleague's farewell dinner. She stood on the opposite side of the road, in the shadow of a large plane tree, and watched him through the restaurant's front window. He was not at the bar waiting for colleagues. He walked directly to a corner table near the back, where someone was already seated. The coral dress was not in evidence this evening. She was wearing something gray and simple and understated, which somehow made her look even more striking than she had in the garden. She stood when Richard arrived and they greeted each other with a brief, warm familiarity that made Eleanor, watching from across the street, press her thumbnail sharply into her palm. Not painful. She simply needed something to press against. She stood under the plane tree for perhaps 10 minutes. She did not need to watch any longer than that. She had seen what she needed to see. She had confirmed what she had known but not yet fully admitted to herself she knew. She turned and walked home. She walked at a normal pace. She looked at the street around her, the evening light, the people, the corner shop with its bright produce display spilling onto the pavement. She walked home and let herself in, and stood in the hallway of her own house, and looked at the familiar things around her, the coat rack, the small table with its bowl of keys, the photograph on the wall of their wedding, the two of them young and bright, and full of something that had looked, at the time, like certainty. She looked at herself in the photograph for a long moment. She had been 28. She had believed, genuinely and completely, in everything that was being promised that day. She had been someone who believed in things completely. She thought, it is not foolish to have believed in something that turned out not to be true. It is only foolish to go on believing it when the evidence has changed. She took her coat off. She hung it neatly on the rack. She went into the kitchen and made herself tea and sat at the table and allowed, for the first time, the full weight of what she now knew to settle around her. It settled heavily. Of course it did. She let it. She did not try to manage or reduce it. She sat with it, this heavy and unwelcome truth, and felt it fully, because she understood that the only way through things was through them, and there were no useful shortcuts. She was still sitting there, tea long gone cold, when she heard Richard's key in the lock 2.5 hours later. "You're up late," he said, in the kitchen doorway. "Reading," she said, though there was no book in front of her. He did not seem to notice. He came in and poured himself a glass of water and talked for a few minutes about the meeting, a project, a client, some negotiation still unresolved. She listened to him construct it. She observed how easily it came, the whole narrative, how detailed and plausible and entirely invented. She said goodnight. She went upstairs. She lay in bed and looked at the ceiling, as she had looked at it 3 nights before, and she felt something that she could only describe as a door closing, not with violence, not with drama, just the quiet, definitive sound of a door that has found its frame and settled into it. She had known, and now she was finished not knowing. She was finished pretending. She was finished being the woman who noticed and looked away. She still did not know what she was going to do, but she knew she was going to do something. She knew it with the certainty of someone who has stopped being afraid of the thing they were circling, and has finally turned and looked at it directly. And she was not afraid. This was the thing that surprised her most, lying in the dark of her room on a Thursday night in June, with the weight of the truth she had gathered over the past week pressing against her chest like a stone. She was not afraid. She was clear. Camille Darcourt came to her. Eleanor had not sought her out. She had not intended any confrontation, had not imagined any meeting between herself and this woman whose name she now knew, and whose face she could not forget. She had been moving, in her careful and deliberate way, toward the point where she was ready to speak to Richard, gathering herself, choosing her words, deciding what she needed to say, and how she needed to say it. She had given herself another week, perhaps 2. She did not get 2 weeks. The Pembrays hosted a second gathering, a smaller one, a Sunday lunch, only 12 or 14 people, an informal follow-up to the garden party. Eleanor and Richard had been invited. Eleanor had been about to suggest they decline, for reasons she could not explain to Richard without explaining everything she was not yet ready to explain. But before she could say anything, Richard had already accepted on both their behalf, with the quick ease of someone who had his own reasons for wanting to attend. Eleanor understood this when they arrived, and she saw, almost immediately, that Camille Darcourt was there. She was standing near the French doors to the garden, talking with Oliver Pembry and 2 others Eleanor did not recognize. She was wearing white today, a simple shirt and wide-legged trousers, her dark hair loose. She looked completely comfortable in the room. She looked like someone who had been attending lunches like this her entire life, which perhaps she had. Eleanor registered her presence with a stillness so complete it was almost physical. She did not change her expression. She did not falter in the hello she was giving to Diane Pembry at the door. She simply noted, and filed, and continued. The lunch was long. 15 people spread across 2 tables pushed together in the Pembrays' dining room, with the windows open to the garden and the warm, slightly too still air of a Sunday in late June. The conversation moved around the table in the way of these lunches, topic to topic, group to group, everyone performing their most agreeable version of themselves. Eleanor was seated at one end, well away from Richard, which was standard at these kinds of dinners, and which suited her entirely today. Camille was 3 seats down on the opposite side of the table. Eleanor did not look at her directly. She did not need to. She was aware of her the way you are aware of weather, as a condition you are operating within rather than something you are choosing to observe. What she noticed, without directly observing, was that Camille looked at Richard. She looked at him with a particular quality of attention that was not obvious to anyone who was not looking for it, and Eleanor was the only person in the room who was. It was the attention of someone containing themselves. Someone practiced at being in the same room as a person they belonged to in ways that cannot be declared. Eleanor ate her food. She talked to the man on her left, a journalist she had met at previous Pembry events whose name was Philip, sharp-minded and good company. She talked to the woman on her right whose name she always confused, and who turned out, today, to be a landscape architect with an interesting theory about English garden design. Eleanor asked good questions. She always asked good questions. It was one of her gifts. At some point during the dessert course, she became aware that Camille was watching her. Not obviously, not the way someone watches you when they want to be caught looking. More carefully than that. Eleanor had the sensation of being assessed, quietly and thoroughly, the way she herself had been assessing things over the past week. She did not look up to confirm this. She simply noted it. When the lunch ended and people began to move out through the French doors onto the terrace for coffee, Eleanor excused herself and went upstairs to the bathroom, taking a moment to stand in the quiet of the landing and breathe properly for the first time in 2 hours. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. She looked, she thought, exactly as she always looked, composed, neat, fine. Which was, she was beginning to understand, both her greatest skill and the thing that had cost her the most. Being fine was a habit so deeply ingrained it had become almost indistinguishable from actually being fine. She was not fine. She was someone standing in another person's bathroom in the middle of a Sunday lunch, 3 feet from the woman who had been with her husband for, how long? Months? More than a year? She did not know yet. And beneath the composure that she wore like a second skin, she was someone in considerable pain, holding herself extremely steady, because the alternative was something she could not allow in a room full of other people's good china. She fixed her lipstick. She went back downstairs. Camille was waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs. Not obviously waiting. She was standing near the hallway table, looking at a framed photograph on the wall, in the way of someone who has simply found themselves there. But Eleanor knew, the moment she reached the bottom step and saw her, that this was not accidental. They stood within 3 feet of each other. Up close, Camille was striking in a way that photographs would not have captured. Not simply pretty but vivid, with dark eyes that held a quality Eleanor could only describe as decision. "You're Eleanor," Camille said. Her voice was low and even. She did not phrase it as a question. "I am," Eleanor said. There was a pause, a long one, the kind that contains everything neither person has said yet. "I've been aware of you," Camille said, "for some time." "I imagine you have," Eleanor said. She could feel her own heartbeat. She was not sure she had ever been this aware of it before. This strong, steady percussion against the inside of her ribs. She kept her face composed. "I think," Camille said, and her voice was careful now, measuring each word, "that we should speak honestly." "I'm listening," Eleanor said. What came next arrived without warning, and without any of the preliminaries she might have expected. Camille spoke in a low, quick voice, low enough that it would not carry to the terrace. She told Eleanor that Richard had been trying, for more than a year, to end the marriage. She told Eleanor that she, Camille, was not the reason for the end of the marriage, that it had been ending before she came into it, and that Richard had told her the same thing many times. She told Eleanor that she thought it was better to be honest than to go on this way, in the same rooms, in the same circles, pretending. Eleanor listened to all of this. She was very still. She let the words arrive and settle without reacting, because she had learned, in the last 10 days, the value of receiving information before deciding what to do with it. When Camille stopped speaking, Eleanor said, "And what is it you want from me exactly?" Camille looked at her steadily. "I want you to stop making it harder than it needs to be." Eleanor blinked. She was not sure she had heard correctly. "I beg your pardon?" "You are making it difficult for him," Camille said. The carefulness in her voice had thinned slightly. The decision Eleanor had seen in her eyes was more visible now. "He is not able to—" "Stop," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet. It was very quiet, in fact. But it stopped Camille mid-sentence in a way that was entirely out of proportion to its volume, because it carried with it a quality that no amount of practice or composure could manufacture. The quality of a woman who has just understood something clearly and completely, and is in no mood to be told a story. "Stop there." Camille stopped. "You have just told me," Eleanor said, "that the obstacle to your happiness is me, that I am making things difficult by continuing to exist in my own marriage. Is that correct?" "I didn't say—" "I want to be very clear about what you have said," Eleanor said, still in that quiet voice that was somehow more arresting than a raised one, "because I would like to understand exactly what is being asked of me. You want me to make things easier, for you, and for my husband, who has been— For how long did you say?" Camille was silent. "Over a year," Eleanor said. "That is what you told me. Over a year." There was a sound from the terrace. Laughter. Someone dropping a teaspoon. The easy sounds of a Sunday afternoon. The gap between those sounds and this hallway was enormous. "I am not going to make things easier," Eleanor said. Her voice was still perfectly even. "I am not going to step aside. I am not going to be reduced to an inconvenient detail in a story about someone else's happiness. I have spent 11 years in my marriage, and I am going to deal with my marriage on my own terms, in my own time. Whatever you and Richard have decided between yourselves is not my problem to solve." Camille's jaw had tightened. She had not expected this. Eleanor could see that. She had expected, perhaps, tears, or silence, or the kind of dignified, wounded withdrawal that comes from a woman who has been made to feel she has no standing. "He doesn't love you," Camille said, and her voice, now, had an edge in it. The careful measure was gone. It was, Eleanor thought afterward, the wrong thing to say. Not because it was not possibly true. She was not certain anymore about what was true, but because it was said in the voice of someone who was not speaking from honesty, but from the desire to wound. "I think," Eleanor said, "that you should go back to the terrace." "You can pretend all you like," Camille said, "but you know exactly what I'm telling you." "I know," Eleanor said steadily, "that you are standing in Oliver Pembry's hallway on a Sunday afternoon, telling me things about my own marriage as though they are yours to tell. And I know that the fact that you feel entitled to do this tells me a great deal. But I will not be managed in my own life by you, that I can promise you." Camille looked at her. Something moved across her face, not exactly regret but something adjacent to it. The brief recognition that this had not gone the way she had planned. Her hand moved. Eleanor did not register it until it had already happened. A split second too fast, too sudden. The open-handed slap landed against her left cheek with a sharp, clean sound that was unmistakable in the quiet of the hallway. Eleanor's head turned with the force of it. The sound carried. There was a moment, perhaps 2 full seconds, when everything was completely still. Eleanor stood with her cheek burning and her eyes very wide, the shock of it overriding everything else for a single, suspended instant. Then, from somewhere very close behind her, a hand closed around Camille's wrist. Firm, unhurried, absolute. Eleanor turned her head. Standing in the doorway behind her, having come in from the terrace at precisely the wrong moment, or precisely the right one, was the man she had noticed at the garden party. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair going gray at the temples. The glass of something clear with ice was no longer in his hand. His hand was around Camille's wrist, and Camille's arm was frozen in the air, and the expression on his face was the most controlled and most serious thing Eleanor had seen in many days. He held Camille's wrist without speaking. He did not need to speak. He simply held it, with a steadiness that communicated, without any words at all, that the hand was not going anywhere near Eleanor's face again. Then he released it, slowly, deliberately, and he turned to Eleanor. "Come," he said. The word was quiet. "There's somewhere more comfortable." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. She looked at Camille, who was standing with her wrist at her side, and something complicated in her expression. Anger and embarrassment, and something that might, in another person, have been shame. Then Eleanor turned and followed the man she did not yet know into the interior of the house, and the hallway was left behind them, and the Sunday afternoon closed over it like water over a stone. Her cheek was still warm. She pressed her fingertips to it once, briefly, and then let her hand fall. She did not look back. He led her not toward the terrace where the other guests were still gathered, their voices drifting through the open French doors, but in the other direction entirely, down the inner hallway and through a door she had never been through before in all her visits to Ashford House, because it was not a door that was opened for guests. The library was long and quiet and smelled of old paper and cedar and the faint, pleasant warmth of books that had been in a room for a very long time, floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 sides, a large window on the 4th, looking out over the back garden away from the terrace, where no one currently stood, 2 deep chairs in dark green leather facing each other across a low table, a small writing desk in one corner, a clock on the mantelpiece that ticked with the comfortable, steady rhythm of a clock that had been ticking in the same place for a century. He gestured to one of the chairs. She sat. He sat in the other. He did not immediately speak. The clock ticked. Outside the window, the garden was still and golden. Eleanor became aware, after a moment, that her hands were shaking slightly. Not dramatically. Just the faint, controlled tremor of a body that has absorbed something large and is quietly processing it. She folded her hands together in her lap and held them still. "I'm sorry," she said. She was not entirely sure what she was apologizing for. "Don't be," he said. His voice was level, not soft in the way of condolence, which she found she was grateful for. Simply level. "I don't know your name," she said. "James Ashford," he said. And then, a beat later, as if it were an afterthought rather than a title, "The Duke of Foxmere, if that's relevant." "It generally isn't." She looked at him. "You live here." "This is my family's house, yes. The Pembrys have the run of it for most of the year. I'm rarely here." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "Then I'm sorry for the scene in your hallway." "You didn't make the scene," he said. "You were the scene's recipient." She almost smiled, not because anything was amusing, because the precision of the phrase was, in this moment, exactly the right thing, and she had not expected anything right. He stood and went to a small sideboard near the desk. He poured tea from a pot that had apparently been prepared there at some point. She did not ask how it had come to be there, it seemed, like everything else about this room, simply to have been there exactly when needed. He brought her a cup. He sat back down. He poured his own. He did not ask her to explain herself. He did not offer the particular brand of sympathy that required a person to narrate their pain in order to deserve comfort. He did not fill the silence with anything. He simply sat across from her and let her hands stop shaking, and waited. She had not known, until this moment, how much she needed someone to wait. "My husband," she said, after several minutes, "is presumably on the terrace." Presumably, he agreed. He doesn't know any of this has happened. Not yet. She was quiet again. She looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. She looked at the spines of the books on the nearest shelf. Old volumes, cloth-bound, their gold lettering faded but still legible. She thought about the fact that she was sitting in a library that belonged to a duke of somewhere, drinking tea from a cup that had been poured without her asking, while her cheeks slowly stopped burning and the life she had spent 11 years building stood somewhere on the other side of this house, unknowing. "What happens now?" she said. She was not asking him, specifically. She was asking in the way people ask when they have reached the end of what they can anticipate and need to hear the question spoken aloud. "What would you like to happen?" he said. She looked at him. He had an expression she had not encountered often in her life, entirely present, entirely attentive, with none of the performance of attention. He was simply listening, looking at her as though the answer she gave was the only thing of any importance. "I would like," she said slowly, "to go home, and I would like to have the conversation with my husband that I should have had some days ago, and I would like to be done with pretending." He nodded, as though this was the most reasonable thing he had heard all week. "Then I would do those things," he said. In that order. She looked at him for a moment longer. He was not handsome in any easy or decorative way. She had thought this in the garden and she thought it again now. But there was something in his face that was more than that. Something that came from within it rather than sitting on its surface. She thought that this was a man who had been honest with himself about things at some cost, and that this had given his face a quality she could not name but could recognize. "Thank you," she said, "for the wrist and the tea." Both were entirely straightforward, he said. There was a dryness in it, very slight, that was somehow more comforting than warmth. She set down her cup. She stood. She smoothed her dress. She walked back through the library door and down the inner hallway and out through the house and onto the terrace where the other guests were still arranged with their coffee cups, talking in the June afternoon sunlight as though the world was entirely undisturbed. Richard was near the railing, talking to Oliver Pembry. He looked up when she appeared, and she saw something move quickly across his face, a flicker of something he suppressed immediately. She walked to him. "I'd like to go home," she said. He looked at her once, really looked at her, the way people look at someone when they have sensed something has changed. She held his gaze steadily. "Of course," he said. He made the appropriate farewells. Oliver walked them to the door. Diane pressed Eleanor's hand and said the lunch had been wonderful for having them. Eleanor said all the right things. She was, as always, impeccable at the right things. She did not look for Camille as she left. She did not need to. She did not look back at the house as they walked to the car either, but she was aware, for just a moment, of the long library window facing the back garden. She could not see into it from where she stood. She got into the car. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited. Richard got in beside her. He started the engine. He did not speak. Neither did she. Not yet. But the silence between them, this time, was different from every other silence they had shared in the car home, from every other event over the last several years. This silence had weight and direction. It was the silence before something that had been held back for too long finally arrived. Eleanor looked out through the windscreen at the road ahead. The afternoon was still brilliant and clear. The world appeared entirely normal. She knew she was about to change it. She waited until they were home. Richard drove in silence for the entire journey. He did not turn on the podcast he usually listened to. He did not make the easy small talk he was so skilled at. He drove with his eyes on the road and his hands on the wheel, and he was either thinking very carefully or doing a very good impression of it. Eleanor sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the city going past and thought about what she was going to say. Not the exact words, she did not believe in scripting these things, but the shape of it, the outline, what she needed to establish, and in what order, and where she needed to end up when it was done. She also thought, briefly and without meaning to, about the library, about a man named James Ashford sitting across from her in a dark green chair with his tea, not asking her to explain herself, and the particular relief of that. She put this thought to one side. It was not useful right now. They pulled into the driveway. Richard turned off the engine. Neither of them moved for a moment, the brief suspension of two people who both know what is coming and are each, in their own way, preparing. Eleanor got out of the car. She walked up the path. She opened the front door. She went into the kitchen and filled the kettle and set it on, because she needed something to do with her hands while she began, and also because she thought this conversation would be long, and the having of something warm would help. Richard came in behind her. He set his keys on the counter. He stood near the kitchen table with his jacket still on, watching her. "Sit down," she said. Her voice was calm. It surprised her. She had expected her voice to require effort to control, and it did not. It came out calm on its own. He sat. She turned to face him. She did not sit herself. She stood with her back against the kitchen counter and looked at him across the table and said, "I know about Camille." The effect of these words was visible even on Richard, who was not someone whose feelings showed easily. She watched something happen in his face, not surprise exactly, more like the complex settling of someone for whom a long-held secret has finally broken the surface. Relief and fear, and something else she could not name, all moving across his features in the space of a few seconds. He did not deny it. She gave him credit for that. Afterward, when she thought back on the conversation, he was many things, but he did not, in this moment, insult her with a denial. "How long?" she said. He looked at the table. He looked at her. He said, 18 months. The number was larger than she had expected, even accounting for everything she had seen and deduced. 18 months. She stood very still with this. She let it settle around her. "When you told me you were in Edinburgh," she said. "Yes." "The Christmas you told me the dress was sold out." A pause. "Yes." She nodded once. She was not performing composure. She was genuinely composed, in the way of someone whose clarity has already done the hardest work, and whose emotions have not yet caught up to their understanding. The emotions would arrive, she knew that, but they were not here yet. Right now there was only this. 2 people in a kitchen in the late afternoon, and 11 years of marriage, and the truth finally on the table between them like a thing neither of them could lift. "Tell me the rest of it," she said. "Eleanor, tell me the rest," she said. "I want to know how much of what I believed in was real." He told her. She stood and listened. She did not interrupt. She did not cry, which continued to surprise her. She asked specific questions when something was unclear. She was, throughout the telling of it, so entirely steady that she saw, at several points, something approaching discomfort in Richard's face, as though her composure was harder to manage than tears would have been. This was not intentional. She was simply the person she was. It was not a short conversation. By the time the full shape of it had been laid out between them, the 18 months, the Edinburgh trip and several others before it, the early evenings and the late messages, the dress that was not sold out, the March weekend he had said was a work conference, the light in the kitchen had shifted from afternoon to early evening, and the kettle had been forgotten and switched off untouched. When he had finished, there was a silence. "She told me," Eleanor said, "that you have been trying to end the marriage. For over a year." He looked at her. Something in his expression changed. "She said that to you?" "This afternoon, in Oliver's hallway, before she slapped me." Richard's face went pale. Yes, Eleanor said. He pressed his hand briefly over his mouth. She watched him do this, and felt, beneath all the clarity, the ghost of something, of what it had meant, once, to know someone's face. "Eleanor, I'm sorry, that should not have." She was stopped, Eleanor said. "There was someone nearby." "Who?" "Someone I don't know well." She paused. "James Ashford." Something moved across Richard's face, a quick, complicated recognition. The Duke. His voice was flat. "Yes." He was quiet. He looked at the table. "Are you hurt?" "Not physically," she said. And then, because even now she could not be dishonest, or not very. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who had been, she now understood, managing something much larger than he had told her, and who was beginning to understand the cost of it. "I didn't want it to happen like this," he said. "How did you want it to happen?" she asked. Not bitterly. Genuinely. He could not answer. She had not expected him to. "I need to understand something," she said. "Were you ever going to tell me?" The pause was answer enough, but he gave her a real one. "I was afraid," he said, "of what it would mean, of what I would lose." "You should have been afraid of what I would discover," she said. "That was the more immediate concern." He looked at her. "I know. You have been taking my trust," she said quietly, "and using it as a kind of cover, for 18 months. While I continued to run this household and attend your events and support your career and tend the garden and be your wife." She paused. "I need you to understand that clearly. I need you to see that." "I do," he said. His voice had dropped. "I do see it." She believed him. That was the complicated thing. She believed that in this moment, he did see it. She also understood that the seeing of it now did not return the 18 months, or undo the Edinburgh trip, or make the dress anything other than what it was. Seeing something clearly after the harm of it is not the same as having cared enough to see it before. She thought of Camille's voice in the hallway. "He doesn't love you." She had been right that it was said to wound. but she had been sitting with the words all afternoon, and she needed to be honest with herself about what she felt when she did. She did not believe, sitting here now, that Richard did not love her. She believed, instead, something more complex than that he loved her in the way that was available to him, which had turned out to be much less than she needed. That the version of love he could offer had stopped growing at some point, while she had continued to require something larger. That this was not an excuse, that it was also not the same as nothing. "I am going to arrange for my things," she said. He looked up. "Not tonight," she said. "I am not going to make any decisions tonight, and neither are you. But I want you to understand that we are not going to find a way through this quietly and go on as we have been. I have done that once. I am not going to do it again. Eleanor, I need you to hear me," she said. "Not the version of me that adjusts herself to make things easier. I need you to hear what I'm actually saying." He heard her. She could see it. Whatever he had expected, anger, perhaps, or tears, or the particular kind of wounded withdrawal that he probably knew how to manage, this was not it. This was Eleanor at full height, full clarity, saying the true thing in the voice that would not be redirected. "I hear you," he said. She nodded. She picked up her bag from the kitchen chair. She went through the house and up the stairs. She ran a bath. She sat in it for a long time, in the warm water, in the quiet of the bathroom, while the house below her held the weight of everything that had been said. She did not cry in the bath either. The tears, when they came, arrived much later, in the early hours of the morning, suddenly and without warning, while she was asleep. She woke to them. She let them happen. She lay in the dark and let them happen properly and fully, for long enough that she felt emptied out and strangely clean, and then she pressed her face into the pillow and breathed, and then she looked at the ceiling again. Outside, the city was quiet. The streetlight made its thin line through the curtain gap. She thought of the library, the clock, the smell of cedar and old books, a cup of tea poured without being asked for. She thought of the words James Ashford had said, as simple and direct as a hand extended. "Come, there's somewhere more comfortable." She had not expected kindness from a stranger today. She had not expected much of today at all. But it had arrived, in the middle of everything that had been difficult, and she was still, quietly, surprised by it. She turned onto her side. She closed her eyes. She did not know what came next. She knew that much was going to have to be dismantled. She knew that the life she had constructed over 11 years was going to have to be looked at, and sorted, and understood differently than she had understood it. She knew that this would take time, and that parts of it would be very hard. She also knew, with the same quiet certainty that had arrived in the garden at Ashford House, that she was going to be all right. Not immediately, not easily, but fundamentally, and properly, in a way that mattered. She had been clear about things once before in her life, when she had first decided, at 22, that she wanted to build something meaningful. She had not known then what form that would take. She had not known who she would meet, or what she would love, or where she would end up. She was beginning to understand that she did not know these things now either, and that this was not, as she had always assumed, a frightening condition, that it was, in fact, the beginning of every real thing that had ever happened to her. She slept, eventually. In the morning she was the first one awake. She went downstairs and made coffee, real coffee in the small pot she preferred, and she stood at the kitchen window and looked at her garden in the early light. The roses along the south wall were still brilliant, deep red, entirely unaffected by anything that had happened inside the house. The lavender was purple and buzzing already with the early summer bees. The herb bed needed a little attention along the eastern edge. She noted this and then let the thought go, because it was not the right morning for the herb bed. She poured her coffee. She sat at the table. She did not check her phone. She did not make a list. She sat and drank her coffee slowly and looked out at the garden, and she let herself be simply in this particular morning, which was the first morning of a life that was going to have to be rebuilt. Rebuilt was not the right word, she thought. Rebuilt implied that the structure was gone and she was starting from rubble. That was not accurate. She was not rubble. She was someone who had been building on an unstable foundation for some time without knowing it, and who now knew, and who was going to have to be very deliberate about what she built next, and on what ground she chose to build it. She heard Richard moving upstairs, the particular sound of him, the floorboard near the wardrobe, the tap in the bathroom, the specific tread of his footsteps. She had been hearing these sounds for 11 years, and she knew each of them as well as she knew her own breathing. In a few months, fewer than she could currently imagine, these sounds would belong to a different house, a different morning, and she would hear different sounds. She would have to learn new rhythms. This thought arrived not with grief, but with something that was more like vertigo, the dizziness of understanding that your footing is about to change completely. She finished her coffee. She rinsed the cup. She heard Richard reach the bottom of the stairs. He came into the kitchen. He looked tired. He had not slept well. She could see it. Good, she thought, and then felt, very briefly, guilty for thinking it. Then she let the guilt go. She had spent enough time being careful about other people's feelings. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said. He poured himself coffee. He stood on the other side of the kitchen. The space between them was not angry exactly. It was simply honest. It was the first honest space they had occupied together in what she now understood had been an extremely long time, and the honesty of it was both painful and, in its own strange way, a relief. "I'd like to speak to someone," she said. "A solicitor, before we discuss anything else." He nodded. He had known this was coming. "Yes," he said. "Of course." "I'm not saying that to be combative," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you're not." She looked at him. He was, she thought, a person she had loved, genuinely. That love was not something she could simply remove, like a coat she had chosen to wear and could now choose to take off. It had grown into her over 11 years, and some part of it would be in her for a long time, in the way of all things that have genuinely mattered. This did not make what he had done acceptable. It did not change what she had decided, but it was true, and she was done pretending things were not true. "I hope," she said carefully, "that we can manage this without destroying each other." He looked at her. She saw something in his eyes, not calculation for once, something more like the genuine weight of a man confronting what he has caused. "So do I," he said. "Eleanor, I genuinely—" "Not today," she said gently but firmly. "Save whatever you genuinely want to say for when there are proper grounds to say it. Right now I need you to give me the space to make decisions clearly." He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded. She picked up her bag from the chair beside the table. She took her coat from the rack in the hallway. She called Claire from the front step, and Claire answered on the second ring, and when Eleanor said, "I need you to come to London," Claire said, "I'm already looking at the train times." Eleanor ended the call. She stood on the front step of the house she had lived in for 9 years, with its bay windows catching the morning light, and its blue front door she had chosen herself, and its small paved garden with the lavender in pots either side of the door. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned and walked down the front path and out through the gate, and the gate swung closed behind her, and she walked out into the morning without looking back. She was not done with this house. She was not done with much of what had to be done. There were months of difficult things ahead of her, and she knew it clearly. There would be legal appointments and difficult conversations and evenings that were harder than she could currently anticipate. There would be the dismantling of things she had not expected to dismantle. But she was walking. She was walking of her own choosing, in her own direction, in the morning light, and she was doing it clearly and deliberately and without apology. This was what it felt like, she thought, to stop doing the things she had been doing for 11 years, to stop adjusting, to stop looking away, to stop being the woman who managed things for other people while her own life went unmanaged. It felt, she discovered, considerably better than she had been afraid it would. The morning was bright, the street was quiet, the city was beginning its day around her, and she was part of it, genuinely, presently, entirely part of it. Not as a person in the background of someone else's story, but as herself. Just herself. That would have to be enough. It was, she was beginning to understand, considerably more than enough. It was, in fact, exactly the right place to begin. Claire arrived on the Tuesday afternoon train with a large canvas bag, a bottle of wine she had been saving for an occasion, though not this one, and the particular quality of presence that made Eleanor, upon opening the front door and seeing her on the step, feel something loosen in her chest that had been drawn tight for days. They did not speak much in the hallway. Claire put her bag down and looked at Eleanor, and Eleanor looked at Claire, and then Claire stepped forward and put her arms around her, and Eleanor stood in the embrace for a moment, and breathed. "Come on then," Claire said, pulling back. "Show me the kitchen." She knew Eleanor's approach to things. She knew that Eleanor needed to be doing something while she talked. She knew that making tea, or tidying surfaces, or preparing food gave Eleanor's hands somewhere to be while her mind worked through things, and that this was not avoidance but method. She had known this for 17 years. So they went to the kitchen, and Claire made tea, refusing to let Eleanor do it, insisting with the gentle firmness of someone who understands exactly when to take over. And Eleanor sat at the table with her hands around a warm mug, and began, at last, to tell everything to someone who loved her. It took 2 hours, not because Eleanor was disorganized, she was never disorganized, but because the full shape of it, laid out honestly and in order, was larger than either of them had anticipated. The 11 years, the garden party, the coral dress, the restaurant. The Thursday evening under the plane tree, the Sunday lunch in the hallway, and Camille and the slap that had come without warning. James Ashford, she mentioned briefly, almost in passing. The hand around the wrist. The library. The tea. Claire said nothing while Eleanor talked. She listened with the absolute attention of someone who is not constructing her response but simply receiving everything being said. This was one of the reasons Eleanor had chosen her as a friend 17 years ago, though she could not have articulated it then. The ability to simply receive things without immediately trying to reframe them. When Eleanor finished, Claire sat for a moment. She turned her cup around on the table. Then she said, "The Duke caught her wrist." "Yes," Eleanor said. "And you'd never met him before." "I'd noticed him at the earlier party, but no." Claire was quiet for another moment. She had a particular expression Eleanor recognized, the expression of someone who is organizing their thoughts before they commit to speaking them. "The question is not what Richard has done," she said finally. "You know what he's done. The question is what you need, right now, what you actually need, not what you think you should need." Eleanor looked at her. "Is there a difference?" "Almost always," Claire said. Eleanor thought about this. She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about most things, with full attention, without shortcuts. What did she need? She needed the solicitor's appointment, which was already made for Thursday. She needed to know the practical shape of what came next. She needed to begin the process of sorting out what was hers, and what was jointly held, and what needed to be decided by people with legal training. That was what she should need. What she actually needed, she found when she looked honestly. She needed someone to tell her that she was going to be recognizably herself when this was over. That Eleanor Hartwell, the person she was, not the person she had performed inside this marriage, was going to come out of the other side of this still intact, still her. "I'm afraid," she said. She had not said this before. She had not said it to herself even. "Not of the practical things. I can manage the practical things. I'm afraid that I spent 11 years becoming someone who fitted around someone else, and that when the someone else is gone, I won't know what shape I actually am." Claire looked at her for a long time. "Do you know what I have always thought about you?" she said. "Probably something kind," Eleanor said. "Honest," Claire corrected. "I have always thought that you were the most complete person I knew. Not in the sense of perfect, in the sense that you were always genuinely yourself, even when you were very good at also being whatever a situation needed you to be. You never actually disappeared. You adapted. There's a difference." Eleanor sat with this. "You're still in there," Claire said. "You've been in there the whole time. I've been watching." This was, it turned out, what Eleanor needed to hear. Not because she could not have arrived at it herself, in time, but because some truths arrive more easily when someone who has known you for 17 years says them directly to your face. She looked at the garden through the kitchen window, the roses, the lavender, the herb bed with its south edge overgrowth. "I need to weed that bed," she said. Claire followed her gaze. "I'll help," she said. They went out together into the afternoon. They knelt beside the herb bed with trowels, and they pulled the weeds that had crept in, and they did not talk much, just the occasional comment, the companionable quiet of two people doing a task side by side. Eleanor worked steadily, the earth warm under her hands, the smell of the thyme and rosemary rising around them. She was still in there. She had adapted. There was a difference. She held on to this. Richard came home that evening to find Claire in the kitchen making pasta. She had taken over the kitchen with the cheerful authority of someone who knows the household food situation will otherwise be neglected, and Eleanor setting the table in the way she always set it, carefully, with the things she liked. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. "Claire," he said. His voice was careful. "Richard," Claire said, in a tone that conveyed, with absolute efficiency and no rudeness, exactly where they stood. He ate with them. Eleanor had not told him not to, and she was not going to be unkind. Even now, they ate quietly and spoke carefully, and Claire managed the table in the way she managed difficult things, with a light but firm hand. When he went upstairs afterward, Claire caught Eleanor's eye across the table, and something passed between them that did not require words. Eleanor washed up. Claire dried. They listened to the radio, a late evening program of music they both liked. The evening settled around them. Before they went to sleep, Claire, in the spare room with its window overlooking the garden, Eleanor stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the photograph on the wall. Their wedding photograph. Her, 28, bright and certain. Richard, young and tearful at the vows. She reached up and took it down. She carried it into the sitting room and put it face down on the sideboard, not dramatically, not with grief, simply because she did not want it on the wall anymore, and this was her house. and she was allowed to decide what she wanted on her walls. She went upstairs. She slept deeply, which surprised her. The first deep sleep in many nights. In the morning she woke at 6, before either Richard or Claire. She went to the kitchen and made coffee, and while it brewed she looked at her phone, the first time she had properly checked it in days. There was a text message from a number she did not recognize. She read it. It said, "I hope yesterday did not cost you too much. The library is available whenever you need it. J.A." She looked at this for a moment. She was not sure how he had found her number. She was not sure, entirely, what she made of the message, except that it was, as everything about him had been, in the 2 brief interactions she had managed to have with him, entirely lacking in performance. It said what it meant. It asked nothing of her. She set the phone down. She poured her coffee. She stood at the window and looked at the garden in the morning light. She thought. She was not ready to think about this message. She was in the middle of a very large thing, and she needed both hands for it, and she was not going to let her attention be divided. She thought also, it was kind. It was simply, directly kind. And there was very little of that in the world, in her experience, that arrived without wanting something in return. She would think about it later. She put it away, carefully, in the part of herself where she kept the things she was not yet ready to examine but intended to. She drank her coffee. She went out to the garden. She finished weeding the herb bed. She had things to do. She had a solicitor's appointment on Thursday and a conversation with her husband that was not yet finished, and a friend sleeping upstairs who had come from Bristol on a Tuesday afternoon without hesitation. She had a life to look at clearly and remake deliberately. She was not afraid of the remaking. She had decided this. She was going to make something true and honest and properly hers, whatever that looked like, whatever it required. She pressed her palms into the warm earth and pulled, and the weeds came free, and the herb bed was better for it. She always had been good at this kind of work. The solicitor's appointment was on a Thursday morning in a Holborn office with high ceilings and the particular quiet of a professional space where difficult things were discussed calmly every day. The solicitor's name was Margaret Finch. She was perhaps 60, compact and precise, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and a manner that was not warm in any decorative sense but that was entirely safe, the manner of someone who had seen many versions of this story and did not require Eleanor to pretend it was not a story she had heard before. Eleanor sat across from Margaret Finch and answered questions. She provided documents she had brought in a clear folder, mortgage statements, pension information, a list of joint accounts and their approximate balances, the name of the firm Richard worked for, and a rough sense of his earnings. She had prepared all of this with her usual thoroughness, the same thoroughness she had given to every task in her life. It was easier to be organized. It gave her hands something useful to do. Margaret Finch asked questions and took notes and explained things in the plain, uncomplicated language of someone who understood that her clients needed clarity above all else. She told Eleanor what to expect in the early stages. She told her what her rights were. She told her what the timeline would likely look like and where the complications might arise and what to do when they did. Eleanor listened to all of this and asked specific questions and took her own notes in her small, neat handwriting. When the appointment was over, Eleanor shook Margaret Finch's hand and thanked her, and went out through the high-ceilinged lobby and into the Holborn street, where the city went about its business in the full late-morning sunshine. She stood on the pavement for a moment. She had just taken the first official step toward the end of her marriage. She had sat in a solicitor's office and begun the process of untangling 2 lives that had been woven together for 11 years. She had expected this moment to feel like falling. It did not feel like falling. It felt, instead, like the ground coming up to meet her, solid and reliable and entirely there. She had been afraid of what the ground would feel like, and now she was on it, and it was firmer than she had known. She walked to a coffee shop a few streets away. She sat by the window with a flat white and her notebook, and she wrote several things down. Practical notes, follow-up items, questions she had thought of after leaving the meeting. She was organized. She was moving forward. She was doing the next required thing. And underneath all of that practical activity, something quieter was happening. Something she could not have named precisely or described in ordered terms, but that she could feel in her chest, in the center of her, in the part of herself that had been still and watchful for 2 weeks now. It was the beginning of something. She was not sure yet of its shape. But it had started, and it was moving, and it was hers. She finished her coffee. She paid. She walked out into the London morning and got on the Underground and went home. And she was, with every step, more completely herself than she had been in a very long time. Claire was still there when she arrived back. She was staying until the weekend, insisting that she was working remotely, and that Patrick had the girls completely handled, and that Eleanor was not to argue. Eleanor was not arguing. She was glad of her. She was glad, for the first time in a long time, of everything she had that was genuinely hers. Claire's loyalty, her own kitchen, the roses on the south wall, the work she was going to have to do and the life she was going to build when it was done. She was not grateful for what had happened. She was not going to pretend that this was a gift or a blessing or any of the things that well-meaning people would eventually try to tell her it was. It was painful, and it was a betrayal, and it had cost her something she could not entirely quantify yet. But she was clear, and she was standing, and in the circumstances she had found herself in, she was beginning to think that clear and standing was, in fact, enough of a foundation to build from. More than enough. She went in through the blue front door and hung up her coat and called to Claire that she was home, and Claire called back from somewhere upstairs that there was soup on the hob, and Eleanor went to the kitchen and lifted the lid on the pot and breathed in the warm, familiar smell of something good. She stirred it. She tasted it. She added a pinch of salt and a turn of pepper. She set the lid back on. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at her garden in the afternoon light. The roses, the lavender, the tidy herb bed. She was going to be all right. Not today, perhaps, and not without cost, but properly, truly, in the way that matters. She was going to be all right. She was, she thought, already on her way. 3 weeks after the solicitor's appointment, she replied to James Ashford's message. She had thought about it, intermittently and honestly, during that time. She had not made it into anything it wasn't. It was a courteous message from a stranger who had done her a kindness in an unusual moment. It deserved a courteous reply. She had simply not been ready to give one until now. She typed, "Thank you for your message. I'm sorry for the delay in responding. I have been occupied with the more immediate business of my life, which is perhaps understandable. The library was very much appreciated, and so was the tea. I hope Ashford House suffered no lasting damage from its Sunday afternoon. Eleanor." She read it back. It was careful and measured and slightly formal. It was also, she thought, genuinely herself. She sent it before she could rethink it. The reply came the following morning. She read it at the kitchen table over coffee. It said, "Ashford House has withstood considerably more than a Sunday afternoon. I'm glad the library was useful. It tends to be. I'm in London next week for a few days. There is a small exhibition at the Royal Academy I think might be worth your time, if you find yourself with an afternoon free. No obligation, and no agenda. Just good paintings. J.A." Eleanor read this several times. Then she wrote back, "Thursday afternoon suits me." It was not the beginning of the rest of her life. That had begun some weeks earlier, in a kitchen in Kensington, when she had finally said the true thing and meant it. But it was perhaps the beginning of something smaller and more particular, the beginning of discovering who she was when she was not being anyone's supporting character. She closed her phone, she drank her coffee, she looked at the garden. The roses were still brilliant. They always were at this time of year. She had planted them well, she had tended them faithfully. There was a great deal she had done well, she was beginning to understand, more than she had allowed herself to count. She was going to count it now. The story got out before Eleanor had any say in it. She had known it would. She had known from the moment it happened, in Oliver Pembry's hallway, with the sound of that slap carrying out to the terrace, that there was no version of these events that would remain private. 12 people had been close enough to hear. 12 people with social lives, and social media, and the particular impulse that causes people who have witnessed something dramatic to find ways to share it, without quite appearing to gossip. By the Tuesday following the Sunday lunch, it was in the circles she moved in. By Thursday it had taken on the particular life of stories that travel faster than the people in them, growing details she had not provided, losing details she would have considered essential, arriving at each new recipient already slightly altered by the last pair of hands it had passed through. Eleanor heard versions of it secondhand. Harriet Vane called on Wednesday, not to gossip but to say directly, "I've heard something I want you to know I've heard, so you don't have to wonder whether I know. I'm not going to ask you about it. I simply want to say I'm on your side." Eleanor appreciated this very much. She told Harriet so. They agreed to have dinner when Eleanor was ready. She also received a phone call from Diane Pembry, which was longer and more uncomfortable, and managed with the particular social skill of a woman who genuinely did not know where her loyalties should lie, and had opted for a kind of anxious neutrality. Diane told Eleanor that she was so terribly sorry, that she had no idea, that she hoped Eleanor knew the Pembrys were her friends. Eleanor thanked her and did not press further and ended the call without having given Diane either the reassurance or the drama she had been hovering between hoping for. She did not feel angry about the story traveling. She had expected it. Anger required something to push against, and there was nothing to push against in the ordinary human tendency to share startling information. She simply noted, as it reached her in its various forms, how different the versions were from what had actually happened. In one version, she had wept openly on the terrace. She had not wept at all. In another, she had said something devastating to Camille before the slap. She had said nothing memorable. In the version that seemed most persistent and most detailed, she had fainted against the Duke of Foxmere, who had caught her in his arms. This was so far from the truth it had a certain entertainment value. The fainting version has really taken hold, Claire told her, over the phone from Bristol. Jeffrey Nolan told Patrick's colleague, "It's become quite the story." "Did Jeffrey add anything extra?" Eleanor asked. "He gave you a much better speech beforehand. He's very creative." Eleanor laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. But it was real, and she let it be. The story had a separate version for Camille as well. In most tellings, Camille was presented with varying degrees of sympathy depending on who was telling it, and how they personally felt about things like marriage and honesty, and women who stood in other women's hallways delivering verdicts. Eleanor did not particularly care how Camille was presented. She had too many actual concerns to carry the additional weight of managing how other people felt about someone else. What she cared about, in the time that followed, was the more practical and considerable work of separating a life. This was not romantic, it was not dramatic. It was the steady, sometimes exhausting, always slightly surreal work of going through the contents of an 11-year marriage and understanding what belonged where. The mortgage was in both names. The savings accounts were mostly joint. The pension was Richard's, and entirely so. She had not contributed to a pension of her own for most of her marriage, having moved between part-time roles that she had always intended to make more permanent and never quite had. This was something Margaret Finch noted with a serious expression and described as a material concern. Eleanor noted it too. She put it on the list of things to address. She had a meeting with Richard, a formal one, each of them having spoken to their solicitors in advance, both of them arriving at Margaret Finch's office with the careful restraint of people who have agreed to be civil. Richard brought his own solicitor, a younger man with a good suit and the alert readiness of someone who had prepared thoroughly. They sat in the meeting room with the high windows and spoke about assets and arrangements and timelines. Eleanor sat through this meeting with the same steadiness she had brought to every difficult thing in recent weeks. She was clear. She asked questions. She did not allow herself to be hurried or managed or redirected. She was, she noted privately, rather better at this than she had expected to be. Richard looked tired. He looked in moments like the man she had known, not the careful performer of the last several years, but the younger man beneath that, the one who had cried at their wedding. She did not allow this observation to soften her position. She was sorry for his tiredness in the abstract way one is sorry for the difficulty of a situation that a person has created for themselves, but she was not going to manage it for him. Outside the meeting, afterward, they stood briefly on the pavement. His solicitor had gone ahead. It was just the two of them, on a Thursday afternoon, the city moving around them. "You're doing this very well," he said. He meant it as a compliment. She understood that. "I'm doing it accurately," she said. "That's all." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression was the closest thing to genuine she had seen from him in some time. "I am sorry," he said. "Not as a tactic, not as a way to, I am just sorry, for all of it." She looked at him steadily. She believed him. She also understood that being believed did not mean being forgiven on a timeline that wasn't hers, and that sorry was the beginning of something rather than the end. "I know," she said. "Thank you for saying it directly." They parted on the pavement and went in different directions, and Eleanor walked to the underground without looking back. She had a Thursday afternoon ahead of her. She had her notepad and her list of things to action, and a meeting with Claire later in the week. She had a dinner with Harriet Vane that had been arranged for the following Tuesday. She had a text message she had sent and a reply she had received on Thursday afternoon at the Royal Academy. These things were enough for now. They were more than enough. They were, in fact, the beginning of a calendar that belonged entirely to her, that she was filling with people she chose and plans she made and things she actually wanted to do rather than things she attended, because attendance was expected of her. She got on the underground. She stood in the carriage with her hand on the overhead rail, the city rushing past in the dark outside the windows, and she felt, beneath the weight of everything she was in the middle of, a current of something she had not felt in a very long time. It was, she realized, anticipation. Not grand or romantic or attached to any particular outcome, just the ordinary, genuine anticipation of someone who has plans they have made for themselves and is curious what they will find. She had not felt curious in a long time. She had been managing and enduring and performing and hoping, and all of these things had taken up the space where curiosity lived. Now, in its place, it was coming back. Small at first, tentative, the way things return when they have been crowded out for long enough, not with a rush but with a gradual, quiet reappearance. She thought, glad of it. She was glad of everything small and genuine and returning. The train slowed for her station. She moved through the carriage toward the doors. She came up out of the underground into the afternoon light. She was glad of the light, too. She had been inside too much lately. She was going to go outside more. She was going to tend the garden more. She was going to read the books she had put down in favor of managing things. She was going to be, again, a person with a genuine interior life, instead of one devoted almost entirely to the management of someone else's. She walked home. She passed the corner shop with its produce on the pavement. She passed the plane tree, her plane tree, she thought, the one she had stood under in a darker coat on a Thursday evening weeks ago, watching a restaurant window. She did not need to stand under it again. She had seen what she needed to see. She walked past it without breaking stride and turned the corner into her street, and the blue front door of her house was there at the end of the path, and she reached it and opened it and went inside. Home. Still her home, for now. Still the bay windows and the kitchen and the garden, still hers. Whatever came after, the practical negotiations, the moving of things, the finding of somewhere new, the making of a life in a different shape, that was all ahead of her. She would meet it when she reached it. For now she was home. She was clear. She was moving. It was, she had decided, enough. She had been to the Royal Academy before, many times. She liked it in the way she liked most things she had chosen for herself rather than attended, because Richard preferred them, with genuine, uncomplicated pleasure. She liked the high rooms and the way they held light. She liked the way people moved differently through an art gallery than through almost any other kind of room. More slowly, more attentively, with the slightly suspended quality of people who have given themselves permission to look. She arrived at Burlington House at 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, in a dress she had worn before but which felt different to her now. A deep blue, well-cut, the kind of thing she had always been drawn to and which she had sometimes talked herself out of in favor of things she described to herself as more suitable for the occasion, though she had never been entirely sure what the occasion required exactly. She wore it now. She had decided, going to wear what she actually liked. James Ashford was already there when she arrived. He was standing near the entrance of the main gallery, looking not at the exhibition but at a painting on the opposite wall. A small, unremarkable landscape that she suspected he had looked at before. He turned when she came through the door, and his face did the thing she had noticed in the library, the straightforward attention, no performance in it. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she said. "Some people say they will and then find a reason not to," he said. "I wasn't sure which kind you were." "The kind who does what she says," she told him. "I thought as much," he said. "It comes through." They moved into the exhibition. It was a collection of work by painters from the previous century. Nothing she had seen before. Nothing she had been anticipating. And yet, room by room, it was extraordinary. He said relatively little as they moved through it, which she appreciated. He pointed occasionally at something specific, a quality of light, an unexpected choice of color in a corner, and she looked at what he indicated and either saw it or said so when she didn't. He responded to this without impatience. He did not explain things she had not asked to have explained. They were, she found, easy in the same space. Not easy in the way of long familiarity. They were not familiar, they were two people who had met 3 times in unusual circumstances. But easy in the way of two people whose ways of being in the world were, at some fundamental level, compatible. She could not have explained this more specifically. She only knew that she was not performing anything, and that this had not been true in a professional or social gathering for longer than she could clearly remember. They had tea in the restaurant afterward, in the glass-roofed space with its particular buzzing afternoon quiet. He asked about the solicitor, not in the way of prying, matter-of-factly, in the way he asked everything, as though the subject was not delicate but simply real, and therefore worth acknowledging. She told him. She told him the shape of where things stood, not every detail, not the things that were too private or too raw, but the practical reality, because it was where she was, and she was not going to pretend she was somewhere else. She was done with that. He listened. He did not offer advice she hadn't asked for. He said, when she had finished, "That sounds like a great deal of work." "It is," she said. "Are you managing it?" "Better than I expected," she said. "You seem like someone who would," he said. She looked at him. "Is that a compliment?" "An observation," he said, "though they're not mutually exclusive." She smiled. It felt genuine. It felt, actually, very genuine. the kind of smile that arrives from being honestly amused rather than from the social requirement to look pleased. "You're not what I expected," she said. "For a duke. Most people expect something different," he said. "Usually something considerably more pompous." "I was thinking more along the lines of more distant," she said, "more managed." He considered this. "I spent a good number of years being managed," he said. "It turned out not to suit me." A brief pause. "Divorce does a great deal for one's directness, it turns out." She looked at him. He had not mentioned this before. "When?" she asked. 4 years ago, he said. 7-year marriage, not dramatic, simply two people who had wanted very different things and had been too polite to say so for several years. He picked up his tea. "The politeness was the problem, I found. When you stop being polite and start being honest, things resolve themselves considerably faster, even if faster is harder." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "That is the most useful thing anyone has said to me in weeks," she said. "I'm glad of it," he said. They sat in the glass-roofed restaurant while the afternoon moved around them. They talked, properly, honestly, without the careful management of impression that Eleanor had been performing in social settings for years. They talked about the paintings. They talked about London. They talked about the particular exhaustion of managing a property the size of Ashford House, which he described with a dry precision that made her laugh more than once. They talked about the garden, and she told him about her roses, and he listened with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, full and real and completely without hurry. When they left, they stood on Burlington Arcade for a moment in the late afternoon light. The street was full of people going somewhere. The light was golden. "Thank you," she said, "for this afternoon." "Thank you for coming," he said. She looked at him. She thought about what she was going to say, and then she said it directly, because she was done being indirect. "I don't know what this is. I mean to say, I am in the middle of something large, and I am not looking for anything I'm not ready for." He met her gaze steadily. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I simply thought good paintings and honest company might be useful. I would like to see you again, if you want that. And if you don't, I understand that too." She was quiet for a moment. "Thursday fortnight," she said. "There's an exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery I've been meaning to see." He did not smile in the easy, gratified way of someone who has gotten what they wanted. He simply nodded, as though this was the straightforward and reasonable thing it was. "Thursday fortnight," he agreed. They went in different directions. She walked back toward the underground. She found, not thinking very much. She was simply walking through the city in the late afternoon, in her blue dress, with the memory of 2 hours of good paintings and an honest conversation, and she noticed this with surprise and something like warmth, content. Just that, just the simple, unperformed, genuine contentment of someone who has done something they wanted to do, with someone they found they genuinely liked, and has not had to be anyone except themselves for the whole of it. She had forgotten this feeling. She had forgotten, or had allowed herself to forget, that this was possible, that a few hours could contain simply this, without complication or performance or the management of someone else's needs. She got on the underground. She went home. She went to the kitchen and made herself dinner, something simple, something she liked, and she ate it at the kitchen table and looked at the garden in the evening light and felt, in the quietest and most genuine way, like herself. Just herself. Entirely herself. She was going to hold on to this feeling. She was going to remember that it was available to her, that it had been here all along, waiting for her to stop filling the space with other things. She was going to make room for it. The months that followed were the most practically demanding of Eleanor's life, and they were also, in some way she had not anticipated, the most clarifying. This was not a story about a woman who found that losing her marriage freed her. That was too simple and too convenient a shape for what actually happened. What actually happened was that Eleanor Hartwell went through something large and difficult, and found, on the other side of it, that she was still herself, more fully herself in fact than she had been in some years, not because of what she had lost, but because of what the loss required her to become. In August, she moved out of the Kensington house. This was her choice. The practical negotiations had arrived at a settlement that was fair, and that Margaret Finch described, with professional precision, as in accordance with Eleanor's entitlements. The house would be sold, the proceeds divided, the pension situation addressed, the joint accounts separated. All of this took the kind of careful attention Eleanor was good at, and she gave it, and it was done. She moved into a flat in Islington. It was the second floor of a Victorian terrace, with tall ceilings and wooden floors and a small terrace at the back that was a fraction of the garden she had tended in Kensington, and which she immediately began to plan. She bought 3 rose standards in terracotta pots. She bought lavender in 2 large planters. She bought a small table and 2 chairs for the terrace, and she sat at it, on the morning after she moved in, with her coffee, and she looked at the narrow strip of early morning sky above the terrace walls, and she breathed. She liked the flat. She liked it with the surprise of someone who had not been sure they were going to like anything for a while. It was smaller than what she was used to, and it was entirely hers, and the particular quality of something that is entirely yours, that fits your actual shape rather than the shape you have been performing, was something she had not known she had been missing. Claire drove up on the second weekend to help with boxes. They spent 2 days unpacking, arranging things, arguing amiably about where the kitchen items should live. Patrick called on the Sunday afternoon, and Claire took it into the small sitting room, and Eleanor could hear the murmur of her voice, the warm laughter of a conversation with someone she was genuinely easy with. And she thought about this without sadness. She thought, that is what she is going toward. Not necessarily that, not that specific life, not those 2 people, but that quality, that ease, that genuine warmth between 2 people who have chosen each other honestly. She was going to have that. She did not know the shape of it yet. She was not in a hurry to find out. The divorce was finalized in October. Eleanor sat in Margaret Finch's office and signed the documents and thanked her solicitor, who accepted the thanks with a brief nod and told Eleanor she had managed it well. Eleanor believed this was not flattery but professional assessment and appreciated it accordingly. She shook Margaret Finch's hand. She walked out of the Holborn office into the October afternoon and stood on the pavement. The marriage was over. Formally, legally, completely over. She had expected this moment to feel like something, like relief or grief, or some complicated mixture that she would need time to understand. What she felt was considerably simpler than that. She felt the clean sensation of something that has been resolved, like a problem that has been worked through fully and has arrived at its answer. Not pleasant in itself, not something to celebrate, but done, clear, complete. She walked to a nearby coffee shop. She sat with a flat white and her phone and called Claire. "It's done," she said. "How are you?" Claire said. "Clear," Eleanor said. "Just clear." A pause. "Good," Claire said. "That's exactly right." She called her mother next. Her mother, who was 71 and had lived alone since Eleanor's father died 8 years ago, and who had the particular directness of women who have outlived one large loss and are no longer willing to waste time on formality. Her mother had been told about Richard in August, not before, because Eleanor had needed to be sure of her own footing before she introduced anyone else's concern into the situation. Her mother had taken it with the compact, practical response of someone who had suspected something without being entirely sure what. She had asked 2 or 3 specific questions. She had told Eleanor that she was sorry it had happened, and that she was proud of the way Eleanor was handling it. She had asked about the flat. She had asked, with a casualness that was not casual at all, about the man Claire had mentioned who had caught someone's wrist at a party. Eleanor had given her a level look down the phone and said she would tell her more when there was more to tell. Now, standing outside Margaret Finch's office with the October papers signed, she told her mother the divorce was done. "Good," her mother said. "Now eat something." Eleanor laughed. "I'm perfectly well fed," she said. "You always say that," her mother said. She went to a restaurant nearby, a good one, the kind she had always liked, and which she now had no reason not to go to, simply because there was only one of her. She ordered what she wanted, not what was sensible, and she ate it slowly, and she had a glass of wine, and she sat at the table by the window, and looked at the street outside, and let the afternoon be what it was. She was 38 years old. She had been married for 11 years, and was now not married. She had a flat in Islington with roses on the terrace and wooden floors and tall ceilings and a table that was hers. She had Claire in Bristol, and Harriet Vane in Chelsea, and her mother in Dorset, and Margaret Finch in Holborn, who had described her as managing it well. She had a good solicitor and a newly opened pension account and the beginnings of a freelance editorial consulting work she had been developing since August, something she had always been capable of, and which had been sitting dormant in her while she spent her energy in other directions. She had, she thought, quite a great deal. More than was visible from the outside of things. More than she had been counting recently, because she had been too busy dismantling what was gone to take proper stock of what remained. James Ashford had come to London twice more in the month since the Royal Academy, once for the National Portrait Gallery, which had been very good, once for a dinner, just the 2 of them, a restaurant he knew in Bloomsbury, with the particular quality of a place that has been good for 40 years, and intends to remain so. They had talked for 3 hours and she had not been aware of the time passing. They were honest with each other. This was the thing she valued most, above anything else she might have said about him. He did not require her to perform anything. He did not want her to be more or less than she was. He asked direct questions and received her direct answers without flinching, and he gave his own in return. And the result was a quality of conversation she had not had with a man in. She thought about this, and was honest with herself, perhaps her entire adult life. She did not know, yet, what this was. She was not going to rush to name it. She was someone who had spent 11 years in a life built on insufficient foundations, and she was not going to build the next thing on anything she had not examined thoroughly. But she was also someone who was no longer going to pretend a thing was not what it was. She liked him. She liked him enormously. She liked the way he said exactly what he meant. She liked his dry, precise observations about things. She liked the quality of attention he brought to whatever they were doing. She liked that he had never once told her how remarkable she was. He had simply treated her as someone worth talking to, which turned out to be considerably more meaningful. She finished her wine. She set her glass down. She paid and gathered her coat and walked out into the October city. And the air was cool and carrying the particular smell of autumn in London. Damp leaves and diesel and the faint sweetness of something she could never identify but which always said October to her. She walked home. She walked through the familiar streets that were becoming more familiar as the weeks went on, past the corner she now knew and the coffee shop she now preferred, and the bookshop she had visited 4 times in 3 months, past the florist where she had bought the rose standards and the greengrocer whose owner remembered that she always chose the darkest tomatoes. She was building the ordinary fabric of a life, block by block, preference by preference, the small choices that accumulate over time into the texture of who you are. She was paying attention to it this time. She was building it deliberately, with her own full attention. Her flat was at the end of the street. The light was on in the sitting room. She had left it on this morning, and seeing it glowing as she approached gave her the particular small pleasure of a light left on, the welcome of a room that was waiting. She went inside. She took off her coat. She stood in her sitting room, her books on her shelves, her pictures on her walls, her things arranged in the way she had arranged them, and she breathed. She was fine. She was more than fine. She was, she realized, genuinely well, not performing wellness, not practicing it, not working toward it, actually in it, right now, in this ordinary October evening in her own flat, standing with her coat over her arm. She hung up the coat. She put the kettle on. She sat down in her favorite chair with a book she had been reading, and she opened it, and the October city carried on outside her window, and inside everything was warm and still and quiet. It was, she thought, extraordinarily good, the quiet, the room, the book, the life she had built herself, piece by piece, out of everything that had broken. Extraordinarily, genuinely good. November arrived with the particular gray energy of a city preparing for the cold. Eleanor had always loved November, which surprised people when she said so. Most people preferred the warmer months, the light and the ease of them. Eleanor had always found there was something clarifying about November, the way it stripped everything back to essentials, the way the bare trees showed their actual structure, the way the city went quieter and more purposeful. She was quieter and more purposeful herself these days. The editorial consulting work had taken shape over the autumn, 2 regular clients, a third expressing interest, work she was good at and found genuinely engaging. She had always had a sharp eye for language and a precise sense of what a piece of writing was trying to do and whether it was doing it. These skills, which had been somewhat dormant during the years when she had devoted most of her professional energy to supporting Richard's work and social life, had come back to her with an ease that told her they had never really gone anywhere. They had simply been waiting, patient and available, for her to return to them. She worked in the mornings, at the desk in her spare room that had become her office. She walked in the afternoons, through Islington and into the parks, or down to the canal path with its barges and its winter-bare trees and its occasional herons standing still as sculptures at the water's edge. She cooked properly in the evenings, because she had always liked cooking and had somehow, in the Kensington years, lost it to the management of menus that suited Richard's preferences. She made what she wanted. She ate at the time she wanted. She read until late if the book was good, and went to bed early if she was tired, and did not explain herself to anyone, which turned out to be one of the quietest and most profound small freedoms she had ever experienced. She saw Harriet Vane regularly now. They had slipped into the easy rhythm of women who find, in midlife, a friendship that had been there waiting in the wings of the social obligations they had both been attending to. Harriet was sharp and funny and did not perform warmth she did not feel, which Eleanor found restful. They went to galleries together sometimes. They had dinner. They talked about books and art and work and life, with the directness of 2 women who had been too careful for too long, and had decided, independently and around the same time, to stop being careful. She had dinner with James Ashford twice more in November. He was in London for work reasons she did not inquire into closely, which she appreciated that he did not elaborate on unnecessarily. They had dinner on the first Friday of the month at a restaurant she chose, and on the third Thursday at one he suggested. The dinners were long and honest and good. On the evening of the third Thursday, walking back through Bloomsbury to the Underground, he said, "I would like to visit Islington at some point, if that's something you'd want." She looked at him. The evening was cold and clear, their breath visible in the air. "Yes," she said, "I'd want that." "Not immediately," he said. "Whenever you're ready." "I'll tell you when I'm ready," she said. "Good," he said. She was ready, she found, 2 weeks later. She told him so by text. She had become increasingly direct in her communications with him, which was what he invited in her. And he came on a Saturday afternoon in the last week of November, with a bottle of something good, and the easy manner of a man who had waited for the right invitation, and was not planning to treat it as anything except what it was. She made lunch. He sat at her kitchen table while she cooked, and they talked. He looked at her books. She had a great many books, with genuine attention, pulling things from the shelf occasionally and reading the back cover and replacing them with care. He looked at her terrace through the kitchen window and said the roses were well chosen for a small space. She said she knew. He did not doubt this. They ate at her kitchen table. They stayed at the table afterward, talking. The afternoon went from bright to dim to dark outside, and she turned on the lamp in the corner and they were still at the table when it was fully evening. He stayed for dinner. She had not planned this, and then she had not mentioned it until around 5 o'clock when she said, "I'm going to make pasta if you want to stay," and he said he would like that very much. She made the pasta. He opened the wine. They ate by lamplight. The city was outside the window, quiet now that the afternoon had settled into evening, the occasional sound of the street below. When he left, at 10 o'clock, he stood in her narrow hallway with his coat on, and she stood with her back to the door. "This was very good," he said. "Yes," she said. There was a pause, not an uncomfortable one, the kind that contains something that is being allowed its proper space before being named. "I would like," he said carefully, "to continue this. Whatever this is, I am not in a hurry. I am also not willing to pretend I am indifferent, because I'm not." She looked at him for a moment. This was, she thought, the most direct and the most honest thing anyone had said to her in many years, perhaps the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her at the exact right moment. "Neither am I," she said. He nodded. He opened the door. He said good night in the simple, direct way he said everything. She closed the door. She stood in her hallway for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Her flat was warm around her. Her books were on her shelves. Her roses were dormant on the terrace, resting for the winter and gathering themselves for the spring. She was going to be fine. She had known this for some time. But knowing something and feeling it are not always the same arrival, and tonight she felt it. The particular settled knowledge of a woman who is exactly where she is supposed to be, moving in exactly the right direction, at exactly the right pace. She went to bed. She slept immediately, deeply, without any of the wakefulness that had stalked the early months. She slept the way you sleep when the mind is easy, when the day has been good and honest and your own, when there is nothing hiding in the dark that you haven't already looked at and named. She woke in the morning and lay in the gray November light and listened to the sounds of her street beginning its day. And she was, she realized, happy. Not dramatically, not the glittering, performed happiness of someone who needs to demonstrate their contentment to themselves. The quiet, ordinary, deeply real happiness of someone who is living a life that fits them. She had forgotten what this felt like. Now she remembered. December brought the city to life in the way it always did. The lights on the streets, the particular busyness of a world preparing for celebration, the feeling that things were drawing to an end and a beginning simultaneously. Eleanor had always liked this quality of December, the way it sat in the gap between what had been and what was coming. She was in the gap herself. She understood this. She was between one version of her life and whatever came next, and she was, for perhaps the first time in her experience, not trying to hurry across it. She was allowing herself to be in it. She was finding, to her considerable surprise, that the gap was not empty. It was full of things she had been too busy, or too managed, or too much somebody's wife to notice. She noticed them now. She noticed that she liked the sound of rain on her terrace in the early morning. She noticed that she had been, all along, someone who preferred silence to background noise, and had spent 11 years accommodating a television she had never much wanted. She noticed that she wrote better in the morning than the afternoon, and that she had somehow spent years forcing herself to be a morning management person and an afternoon work person, which was the exact wrong way around. She had rearranged this. She worked in the morning. She managed things in the afternoon. The work was better. Small adjustments. Small discoveries. The gathering, piece by piece, of the actual person she was. She went to Dorset for a weekend in the middle of December to visit her mother. Her mother's house was small and warm and smelled of the particular things it had always smelled of: beeswax and old books and the dried lavender she kept in a glass jar on the kitchen windowsill. Eleanor arrived on the Friday evening, and her mother made tea and they sat at the kitchen table. And Eleanor told her mother, more than she had told anyone, more than she had told herself in one sitting, the full shape of what the last 6 months had been. Her mother listened without interrupting. This was not unusual. Her mother was a listener by nature and by training. She had spent 40 years in a library, which was, Eleanor had always thought, an excellent school for the kind of attention that does not impose itself. When Eleanor finished, her mother set down her cup. She looked at Eleanor for a moment. Then she said, "You are more yourself than I have seen you in a long time." Eleanor sat with this. "Was it obvious," she said, "that I was less myself?" "Not obvious," her mother said carefully, "but I am your mother. I know what you look like when something is sitting on you." Eleanor thought about this. She thought about the years of managing and accommodating and adapting and not noticing what she was adapting away from. "Why didn't you say something?" she asked. She was not accusatory. She was genuinely curious. Her mother looked at her with the particular directness of a woman who had watched her daughter grow up and understood her well. "Because you were not ready to hear it," she said simply. "And because you would not have believed it. You were too determined to make it work." "I was," Eleanor agreed. "Determination is one of your very best qualities," her mother said. "It is also the thing that can keep you in the wrong place for longer than is good for you, because you apply it to whatever you have decided to commit to, regardless of whether the commitment deserves it." Eleanor thought about 11 years of roses, and managed silences, and events attended because attendance was expected. "That is accurate," she said. "It will also," her mother said, "be one of the great things about you in whatever comes next, once you have directed it at something that deserves it." She stayed in Dorset until Sunday. She walked on the coast path with her mother on the Saturday, both of them wrapped against the December cold, the sea gray and wide and uncomplicated below them. They did not talk about Richard. They did not talk about James Ashford. They talked about the things they always talked about: her mother's new project, a local history she was compiling for the village society, Eleanor's work, books they had both been reading, a family gathering planned for the new year. On the Sunday afternoon, driving back toward London, Eleanor found herself thinking about her mother's words. Determination directed at something that deserves it. She had, she thought, spent the last 6 months redirecting things, redirecting her attention, her energy, her considerable capacity for organization and care, and the kind of patient, thorough work that produced things of lasting quality. She had been redirecting these away from the management of someone else's life and toward the building of her own. It was working. She could feel that it was working. In the way you can feel a shift in the actual weight of things when you have been carrying something in the wrong way and have finally worked out the right way to hold it. She was not finished with the redirecting. She did not think you were ever entirely finished, but she was well on her way, which was not the same as being done but was considerably better than where she had been in June. She thought about James Ashford. She had been thinking about him with increasing frequency and with increasing honesty, not in the managed way she had thought about things for most of her adult life, holding back, examining from a distance, assessing before allowing herself to feel, but directly, and with the genuine curiosity of someone who had found something unexpected and was trying to understand what it was. What she found, when she looked at it honestly, was that she liked him in a way she had not liked anyone in a very long time, not the performed or constructed liking of someone building a marriage out of the right materials, the genuine, uncomplicated liking of a person for another person who makes sense to them, who they find interesting, whose company they prefer to being alone. And that was saying something, because Eleanor now valued being alone very highly. He was clear. He was direct. He was funnier than he appeared to strangers. The dryness of his observations had a precision that was, once you were used to it, genuinely amusing. He was honest about his own life without offering it as a subject for her management. He had been through things, the divorce, the weight of a title and a property and all that came with it, and he wore these things straightforwardly, without either dramatizing them or hiding behind them. He was, she had concluded, someone worth knowing, someone she was actively glad to know. And the prospect of knowing him better, over time, with the honesty they had both committed to, was one she found herself looking forward to in the quiet and genuine way she found herself looking forward to the other things she had reclaimed. She got back to London in the early evening. She parked the hire car, She did not yet have her own car, which was on the list of things she would get around to, and walked the short way to her flat. The street was lit for Christmas, the terraces on either side warm with the gold of lit windows. She went inside. She took off her coat. She went to the kitchen and made tea and stood at the window looking at her terrace, where the dormant roses sat in their pots against the wall. Her phone buzzed. A message from James. How was Dorset? She smiled before she had decided to smile. Good, she typed, clarifying. The best kind of visit, he replied. She thought for a moment, then she wrote, Are you in London at Christmas? A pause, longer than his usual ones, then, I am. Ashford House is the family gathering generally, but I could be in London on the 23rd, or the 27th, if that would suit. The 27th, she said, dinner. I'll choose the restaurant. Ideal, he said. She set the phone down. She picked up her tea. She stood at the kitchen window in the warm quiet of her flat, looking at the dormant roses, and she was happy. Quietly, genuinely, entirely happy, with her flat and her work and her mother in Dorset and Claire in Bristol and Harriet Vane in Chelsea, with the December city outside her window and the roses waiting for spring and the dinner on the 27th and whatever came after. She had been, she thought, someone waiting to be claimed. That was the truest thing she could say about the woman who had arrived at Ashford House's garden party in a cream linen dress in June. She had been waiting, without knowing it, to be seen and chosen, and she had been directing this waiting entirely at the wrong person, and paying an enormous price for the direction. She was not waiting anymore. She had stopped waiting and started choosing. Choosing her flat, her work, her friendships, her pace, her direction. Choosing, with care and honesty, the people she wanted in her life. She was choosing herself, which was, she now understood, where you had to begin. Not as an act of selfishness, but as an act of honesty. Because you could not give anyone anything real if you had not first worked out who you actually were. She knew who she was. She was Eleanor Hartwell. She was 38 years old. She had a flat in Islington with roses on the terrace, and she had good work she was good at, and she had friends she had chosen, and she had a mother who knew what she looked like when something was sitting on her. She had been through something large and difficult, and she was standing, clear and steady, on the other side of it. She was going to plant new roses in the spring. She was going to take on more work she found genuinely interesting. She was going to call Claire more, and visit Harriet more, and go to Dorset more, and read the books she wanted, and cook the food she liked, and walk along the canal path in every season, and attend only the events she actually wanted to attend. She was going to have dinner on the 27th with a man who said what he meant and listened when she spoke, and did not require her to be any version of herself except the actual one. She was going to build something true. She was, she found, very much looking forward to it. The new year came and went. Eleanor spent it quietly, not from lack of options. Claire had invited her to Bristol, and Harriet had extended an invitation to a dinner party she was hosting, and she had the dinner with James on the 27th, which had been very good, and had ended with both of them standing outside the restaurant in the cold December air, and agreeing, without particular drama, that they would like to do this regularly, and that regularly could mean whatever they decided it to mean. She had gone home from that dinner feeling something she was still getting used to feeling, uncomplicated, undivided, not managing anything or accommodating anything or worrying about the impression she was making, just genuinely happy to have spent an evening with someone she liked. She had stayed home on New Year's Eve. She had made herself a good dinner. She had opened a bottle of wine she had been saving. She had read. She had heard the fireworks from outside her window just after midnight and had gone to the terrace in her coat to look at the black December sky for a moment, and she had thought, this is the first year of the rest of it, whatever the rest of it turns out to be. Then she had gone inside and gone to bed and slept very well. January was gray and cold and busy. The editorial consulting work had expanded. The third client had confirmed, and with it a monthly retainer that meant she could stop thinking about money quite as carefully as she had been for the last few months. She worked well in January. She found that the discipline of a cold month suited her brain, the clarity of it, the indoor focus. She produced some of her best work in January. She noted this with satisfaction. She saw James twice in January, once when he was in London briefly for a meeting, and once when she took the train to Richmond on a Saturday to walk in the park, which was a thing she had suggested and he had agreed to with the ease of someone who had no complicated feelings about a Saturday walk. They walked for 2 hours, through the cold and the bare winter park, and talked about almost everything except the things that might have been considered significant, and the result was exactly the kind of afternoon that felt, afterward, like the foundation of something, not a beginning. something that had already begun and was continuing. In February, she found herself, unexpectedly, at a dinner party at which Camille Darcourt was also a guest. She had not been told this in advance. It was a gathering at the home of a couple she had known for some years, friends she and Richard had shared who had, in the months since the separation, gently and graciously remained her friends, which she had not taken for granted. She arrived to find, when she came through the doorway, a room of perhaps 10 people, and Camille among them. She registered this without expression. She had a moment in the hallway, handing her coat to her host, during which she breathed and thought about what she was going to do. What she was going to do was go in. She was not going to leave. She was not going to create a scene or make anyone uncomfortable or require her hosts to manage the situation. She was going to walk into the room and be exactly who she was. She walked in. Camille was standing near the window. She registered Eleanor's arrival and went very still for a moment. Eleanor crossed the room to say hello to the hosts. She spoke to the nearest group. She was, as she always was, good company. At some point during the evening, she and Camille found themselves near each other, not by design on Eleanor's part, by the arithmetic of a small room and a long dinner. Camille spoke first. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said. Her voice was careful, not combative, simply careful. "Neither did I," Eleanor said. "But here we are." A pause. Camille looked at her with the same dark eyes she had seen in the garden, at the Sunday lunch, in the hallway before the slap. There was something in her face that was different now. Not guilt exactly, not quite. More the expression of someone who has had several months to consider their own actions and has not been entirely comfortable with what they found when they did. "I owe you an apology," Camille said. Quiet, direct. Eleanor looked at her. She had not expected this. She was, she found, not sure what to do with it. "For the slap," Camille said. "That was wrong. I know that." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She thought about what she actually felt. She had been through enough in the last several months to be a poor audience for dishonesty, including her own. What she actually felt was something like this. She did not hate Camille. She had never hated her. Hatred required a kind of continued investment in the wrong that had been done, and Eleanor had not been willing to make that investment. She had been too busy building things she actually wanted to waste energy hating someone she barely knew for doing something that was, in the end, Richard's failing more than hers. But she was also not going to pretend that the slap, and what had been said in that hallway, had been nothing. "I accept the apology," she said. "For the slap." "Yes." Camille looked at her for a moment. "You're very composed," she said. There was something in it that was not a criticism. "I've had a lot of practice," Eleanor said. Something shifted in Camille's face, not quite softening, more like the expression of someone looking at something clearly for the first time. "He didn't deserve you," she said. This was not said generously. Eleanor understood that. It was said with the complicated mixture of feelings that belonged to a woman who had become involved with a married man, and had told herself various stories about the wife in order to feel easier about it, discovering that the wife was not, in fact, the difficult and distant and unappreciative presence she had been described as. This was its own kind of reckoning. Eleanor did not intend to have Camille's reckoning on her behalf. "What happens between you and Richard is not something I have feelings about anymore," she said. "That's not a performance. I simply don't. I have other things to give my attention to." Camille looked at her. Are you all right? Genuinely?" "Genuinely," Eleanor said, and meant it. They did not become friends. They did not have more conversations that evening. But the brief exchange left Eleanor feeling something she had not expected to feel about Camille Darcourt. Not warmth, not affection, but a kind of ordinary human understanding. The understanding of someone who can see, without endorsing, how a person ended up where they did, and can decline to spend more energy on it. She drove home that evening thinking about this, about how much lighter she felt in general than she had expected to feel a year after the day her marriage began to end, about how much of what she had carried had been weight she had given herself, the performance, the management, the looking away. She had put it all down. The weight was still on the floor somewhere, but she was no longer carrying it, and the difference to her back and her breathing and the clarity of what she could see from where she stood was, she found, extraordinary. She parked outside her flat. She sat in the car for a moment. She thought about what the last 8 months had actually done to her, and she tried to be honest about it. It had broken something, yes. It had broken the version of herself that believed if she was good enough, and patient enough, and careful enough, things would eventually arrange themselves into the shape she was hoping for. That version was gone. She was not sorry to have lost it. It had been expensive to maintain, and it had not, in the end, served her. What had replaced it was less certain but more real. The willingness to see things clearly and say so. The willingness to act from her own judgment rather than the expectation of the room. The understanding that the life worth building was the one that actually fit, not the one that looked well from the outside. She was building that life. She was already in it. She was going to keep building it, one honest decision at a time. She got out of the car. She let herself into her flat. She made tea. She sat in her chair by the lamp. She was going to call James in the morning. She was going to tell him about the dinner, and he was going to ask specific questions, and she was going to answer them, and it was going to be, as it always was with him, honest and good. She was going to call Claire next week. She was going to visit her mother in March. She was going to have lunch with Harriet on Tuesday and submit the edited manuscript to her client by Friday and buy more compost for the roses when the weather turned. She had a life, a real one, entirely her own, one she had chosen. She sat with her tea in the lamp in the quiet February evening, and she felt it, the full, settled, genuine weight of a life that was hers. It was exactly enough. It was more than enough. It was, she thought, everything. Spring arrived the way it always did, not with a grand announcement but with a series of small, specific changes that accumulated until you looked up one morning and understood that winter was properly gone. Eleanor knew this the morning she went out to her terrace and found the first roses beginning to open. She had been watching for it. She had been out every morning since the middle of March, checking the canes she had pruned in January, watching the new growth come slowly, the tight red buds appearing one and then another and then several more. But this was the first actual opening. 3 blossoms on the largest of the 3 standard roses, deep red and perfect and entirely uninterested in the significance she was giving them. She stood in her dressing gown in the early April morning and looked at the roses and felt something she could only call gratitude. Not for the things that had happened. She was not going to pretend that being betrayed and publicly humiliated and forced to dismantle 11 years of her life was something to be grateful for, but for where she was now. For the flat and the terrace and the work and the people and the roses she had planted herself in their own ground, in pots she had chosen, in a space that was entirely hers. She had been building for a year now. She was still building. She thought she always would be, that this was in fact the point. Not the arrival at some fixed destination, not the achievement of a perfect and settled state, but the ongoing and genuine work of making a life that fit and tended it carefully and let it grow. She had not expected, in June of the previous year, standing under a plane tree across the street from a restaurant she had not wanted to know anything about, to be here. She had not been able to see this far. She had only been able to see as far as the next day, and then the next week, and then the next decision. She had made each decision as honestly as she could, and the decisions had accumulated into this morning, these roses, this life. She was going to Ashford House in June. This was the thing she had not entirely believed until she found herself actually planning for it. The Pembrys were hosting the annual garden party again, a year on from the afternoon that had changed everything, and Eleanor had been invited, not as Richard's wife, not as anyone's appendage or representative, as Eleanor Hartwell, who was now a person that Diane Pembry liked in her own right and wanted at her party. She had thought about whether to go. She had thought about it seriously, because she was not someone who made decisions casually or who attended events without knowing why she was there. She was going because she wanted to. That was the reason. She wanted to walk into Ashford House Garden again, that beautiful place with its cedar tree and its river end and its sweet peas on the tables, and she wanted to be there as herself, not managing anyone, not performing contentment, not playing a supporting role in someone else's story. Just there, as she actually was, with the people she had actually chosen. James would be there. Not as an escort or a declaration, but as a person she had been seeing, honestly and without hurry, for the last 10 months. They had arrived at something. She was not going to overdefine it, because she had learned the cost of overdefining things, of building structures around what you had and then defending the structure rather than seeing the thing clearly. What she had with James was honest and growing and genuinely good, and she intended to keep it those things. She knew he would be at the garden party because he had mentioned it casually, in the way he mentioned things, without implication, simply as a fact. She had said she was also going. He had said, "Good. The cedar tree is better when you're there." She had thought about this for some time afterward, and decided that it was the nicest thing anyone had ever said to her. She went inside and made coffee. She opened her laptop and looked at the work she was planning to do this morning, a manuscript she was editing for a publisher, a piece of non-fiction that was almost very good, and needed someone with a clear eye to find the places where it was hedging and tell it to stop. She was good at this. She was getting better at it. The work was expanding in the way that good work expands when you give it your full attention, steadily, organically. by word of mouth and reputation. She had been asked recently whether she had ever thought about writing something herself. This was from a writer whose manuscript she had worked on, and who had read her editorial notes with the particular attention of someone who recognized that the person giving the notes had a genuine sense for language. She had said she had not been thinking about it, which was true. The writer had said she should. She had begun, very quietly, to think about it. Not a memoir. She was not interested in narrating her own experience for public consumption. That was not how she worked, and it was not, she thought, the best thing the experience could produce. But something, some shape that could contain what she had learned, in the way that good writing contained things, not by stating them directly, but by being so precisely itself, that the truth emerged from the form of it. She would think about it. She was not going to hurry it. Hurrying was not, she had come to understand, one of her skills, and this was all right. The things she produced when she took her time were considerably better than anything she had rushed. The April morning was warm. She opened the terrace door. The sounds of the city came in, distant traffic, a bird she did not know the name of, the clatter of a bin from the alley behind the terrace. She liked these sounds. She was learning to like all the sounds of her specific place. The way you learn a piece of music until it is familiar, and then you like it not despite its familiarity, but because of it. She thought about the garden party. She thought about standing on the terrace at Ashford House a year ago, holding a glass of wine carefully because her hands had been shaking, and looking at a woman she did not know standing beside her husband in a rose arbor. She thought about the hallway, and the slap, and a hand closing around a wrist. She thought about a library with cedar-scented air, and a clock, and a cup of tea poured without being asked for. She thought about driving home from the Pembrays on a Sunday in June, with everything changed and her face still warm, and Richard talking about the party in the voice of a man who believed nothing had shifted, while beside him, Eleanor sat in perfect stillness and knew that everything had. She thought about a Tuesday in a kitchen, and the name in an inbox, and a Thursday under a plane tree, and a solicitor's office with high ceilings. She thought about Claire arriving with wine she had been saving. She thought about her mother on the cliff path in December, the gray sea below them. She thought about a flat in Islington with roses on the terrace and work she loved, and a Thursday dinner on the 27th that had been the beginning of something she was still becoming. She looked at the roses. They were more open now in the morning warmth, the 3 blossoms she had found at dawn now fully extended, showing their full dark red. They were exactly the color she had chosen. They were exactly where she had planted them. They had survived the winter and come through. She had survived the winter and come through. She sat down at her desk. She opened the manuscript. She read the first paragraph, which was very close to what it was trying to be. She made a note. She moved to the second paragraph. She worked. She was good at it. She was present and clear and entirely herself, in an April morning in her own flat, doing the work she had chosen, on the way toward the life she was building. The roses were open. The morning was warm. The city was going about its business around her, and she was part of it, genuinely, freely, fully part of it, not as someone's wife, not as the woman at the center of that story, as Eleanor Hartwell, who was the center of her own. She had learned, in the last 12 months, a number of things she had not previously known. She had learned that clarity is a kind of courage. She had learned that the things you are most afraid to see clearly are usually the things most worth looking at. She had learned that being alone is not the same as being lonely, and that a life built honestly is more durable than one built for appearance. She had learned that there are people who will stand in a hallway and catch a wrist without being asked to, and that these people, though rare, exist. She had learned that roses grown in good soil, tended with genuine care, and given the patience they require, will always come back in spring. She had not needed 11 years of difficulty to learn these things. She wished she had known them earlier. But she was not someone who wasted energy on what could have been different. She was someone who took what was true and worked with it, methodically and with full attention, until it became something she could build on. She was building. The June garden party was 6 weeks away. She had a dress she intended to wear, dark blue, well cut, the kind she had always actually liked and had now stopped talking herself out of. She had a life she was bringing with her, the flat, the work, the people, the roses, the ongoing and honest story of a woman who had chosen herself and was finding out, daily, how good a choice that was. She was not nervous about going back to Ashford House. She had thought she might be and had found, when she examined it honestly, that she was not. She was curious. She was looking forward to it. She was going to stand on that terrace in June with James Ashford, and a glass of something good, and she was going to look out at that garden and feel nothing except what was actually true, which was that she was fine. She was more than fine. She was someone who had been through a fire, and had not been consumed by it but had, instead, been clarified, stripped of everything that had been excess, everything that had been performance, everything she had been carrying that did not belong to her. What remained was her, just her, Eleanor, steady and clear and looking forward. She turned the page of the manuscript. She made another note. Outside, the morning was warming toward something brilliant. She worked on. 1 year from the morning she had pressed her thumb against her palm to stop a drop of blood staining a cream linen dress, Eleanor Hartwell was sitting at her own desk in her own flat, doing her own work, with roses opening on her terrace and a June afternoon ahead of her, and a life that fit her so well she had almost forgotten it had ever been otherwise. Almost, not quite. She was going to keep the memory, not as a wound but as a record, as evidence of what was possible when you stopped looking away from the truth and started walking toward it, one honest step at a time. She was going to keep walking. She always had been, she understood now. She had simply, for a while, been walking in the wrong direction, and then, on a June afternoon in a garden full of sweet peas and string lights and the particular scent of someone else's roses, she had looked up, and she had seen clearly, and she had turned around. The rest had followed as things do, when you are finally pointed the right way. The Pembrays' garden party fell on a Saturday in the second week of June, exactly 1 year after the Saturday that had changed everything. Eleanor drove to Richmond in the early afternoon, windows down, the kind of June day that arrives as if the summer has been practicing for it all spring. She parked at the bottom of the lane and walked up to the house on foot, which she had not done the year before. Richard had insisted on arriving by car, for reasons she understood now were about the impression it made rather than the journey. She liked walking. She always had. She was walking more, these days, and attending to the ordinary world around her, with the attention of someone who has rediscovered that the world repays it. The gates of Ashford House were open. Diane Pembry was at the door, as she always was, with glasses of wine and the wide smile of the accomplished hostess. She kissed Eleanor on both cheeks and said the blue dress was absolutely beautiful, and Eleanor thanked her and meant it, about the dress and about the welcome, and about the fact that she was here at all, on her own terms, beginning a new year at the same address where the last one had started. She stepped into the garden. It was exactly as she remembered it, and entirely different, because everything she brought to it was changed. The round tables with their ivory cloths, the sweet peas in their glass vases, the hydrangeas and the peonies and the long lawns and the cedar tree at the far end, already threaded with string lights for the evening, the river glinting at the property's edge. The particular quality of light that came to this garden in the afternoon of a good June day. It was beautiful. It had been beautiful the year before. She had known it was beautiful. She had simply been too occupied with managing her own knowledge of what she had seen, and what she feared, and what she could not yet allow herself to know, to be properly present in it. She was present now. She talked to Harriet Vane near the hydrangea border, and this time the conversation was easy and unguarded, and genuinely pleasurable, because she was not divided. She talked to Geoffrey Nolan, and was able to actually listen to his story, rather than listening with one ear while the other tracked her husband across the garden. She found Oliver Pembry and thanked him, which she had been meaning to do for a year, for the library. He looked slightly puzzled. She had the impression he did not know quite what had happened in his house on the Sunday of the previous year, or that the library had been of any particular use, and she explained briefly and watched his expression shift into something warm. "James always did know how to use that room," he said, and smiled. She was talking to the landscape architect she had sat beside at the Sunday lunch, the one who had the interesting theory about English garden design, when she became aware of someone coming to stand beside her. She did not need to look to know it was James. She had learned, over 10 months, the particular quality of his arrival, the way the air around her shifted slightly, the way she became more settled rather than less, which was the opposite of what she had expected and the thing she valued most. She looked anyway. He was there, with the ease she recognized, his dark jacket and the slightly graying temples, and the face that was honest, rather than decorative, and that she had come to find the most interesting face she knew. "You're here," he said. "I said I would be," she said. "You always do what you say," he said. "I do," she confirmed. The landscape architect excused herself, which Eleanor suspected was due to the particular clarity of what she had walked into. Eleanor did not mind. She was past minding things she had no need to mind. She and James walked slowly toward the far end of the garden. They passed the rose arbor, its pale yellow climbing roses exactly as she remembered, in full bloom, entirely indifferent to everything that had happened beneath them. They walked down toward the cedar tree and the river beyond it, where the string lights stirred slightly in the warm air. "How does it feel?" he asked. She knew he meant the garden, the return, the year that had passed. She thought about this honestly, as she did with everything. "Like standing in a place where something important happened," she said, "and discovering that the place itself is simply a place. Beautiful, that's all." "That seems about right," he said. "I thought it might be harder," she admitted. "Most things are either harder or easier than we expect," he said. "This one went the right way." She looked at him. In the June afternoon light, with the cedar tree behind him, and the sound of the party drifting down from the upper garden, he looked exactly like himself, unhurried, present, clear. She thought of the first time she had seen him, at the previous year's party, the man who had moved through conversations and caused brief pauses without apparently meaning to. She had noticed him and moved on, because she had been in the middle of understanding something terrible, and had not had room for noticing anything else. She thought of his hand closing around her wrist, the library, the clock, the tea. She thought of 10 months of galleries and dinners and Saturday walks and honest conversations, of learning a person carefully and finding that what you discovered with each layer was consistently better than what you had expected. She thought of a winter evening in her hallway, and the simplest declaration she had ever been given: "I am not willing to pretend I am indifferent, because I'm not." She thought of her own response: "Neither am I. Neither am I." This was, she thought, the truest thing she had said in a very long time. The beginning of something built on actual ground, with actual materials, between two people who had each learned, the particular and personal way, what happened when you built on less. "Come," James said, and held his hand out to her. She looked at the hand. She thought of another word. A year ago, the same word. "Come," said quietly, no performance in it, just the simple, direct invitation of someone who saw that she needed somewhere more comfortable to be. She had needed it then. She had taken it, and somehow the shape of that moment, the hand, the word, the quiet, had led here, to this afternoon, and this garden, and this hand held out to her in the June sunlight, this time not in urgency but in ease. She took it. They walked together toward the river end of the garden, where the cedar tree stood, and the lights moved gently in the warm air, and the afternoon was long and golden, and full of all the ordinary particular beauty of a good day. Behind them, the party continued its cheerful hum. Voices and laughter, the clink of glasses, the sound of a summer afternoon in a beautiful garden. The world going on as it does, heedless of the private revolutions contained within it. Eleanor Hartwell walked through Ashford House Garden in a blue dress she had chosen herself, her hand in the hand of a man she had come to know honestly, and to like in the truest sense of the word. She walked with her shoulders back and her eyes forward, and the particular lightness of someone who has put down a great deal of weight and is discovering, with each step, how it feels to move without it. She was not the woman who had arrived at this same gate a year ago. She was not performing anyone's idea of who she ought to be. She was not managing anyone's comfort except her own. She was not afraid of what the garden might show her, or what the afternoon might require, or what a stranger might see when they looked at her. She was Eleanor, complete and clear and walking forward. The roses were in bloom all along the south wall, the sweet peas scented the warm air, the river at the end of the lawn moved silently toward the sea. And Eleanor walked in all of it, present and genuine, and she felt, deeply and without question and with every part of herself that was real, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, living exactly the life she had chosen, on the way to everything that was still coming. She was ready for it. She was, she found, very much looking forward to it. She walked on,